The rain fell over Manhattan like a punishment from God. It hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moretti penthouse with the righteous fury of something that had been waiting a long time to be unleashed. And Alessandro Moretti stood before the glass as he always did during storms, still, silent, and entirely unmoved. He held a crystal tumbler of single malt whiskey in one scarred hand, swirling it in slow, contemplative circles, watching the rivulets of water chase each other down the outside of the glass like desperate, dying things. The penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Moretti Tower on Fifth Avenue, and it was a monument to power made manifest in marble and steel. Black Italian marble floors, bespoke mahogany furniture imported from craftsmen in Florence who still worked by hand, the way their grandfathers had. Art on the walls that museums would have wept to own. A Caravaggio here, a Klimt there, and in the corner of the study, a small oil painting of the Amalfi Coast at sunrise that Alessandro had never once been able to look at directly, because his mother had loved it, and his mother was dead, and grief, he had learned, was a wound that never truly closed. It only scabbed over, ugly and thick, until something ripped it open again. He was 30 years old, and he looked like something carved from the same dark, unyielding stone as the city that feared him. 6 feet 3 inches of lean, devastating muscle, with the kind of bone structure that Italian Renaissance painters had spent entire careers trying to capture and never quite succeeding. His jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. His eyes were black, not dark brown, not deep charcoal, but true black, the color of deep water at midnight, the color of a verdict with no appeal. His hair was the same shade, worn swept back from a face that was beautiful in the way a loaded gun is beautiful. Technically perfect, and absolutely, categorically dangerous. They called him l'uomo di ghiaccio, the man of ice, the Ice King. And in the hierarchy of New York's criminal underworld, where men were known by the qualities that made them most lethal, the name was not a slight. It was a warning label. Alessandro Moretti did not feel things. He had decided that 2 years ago, in the white-tiled room of a hospital where a doctor with kind eyes had told him things that turned the rest of the world gray. He had made a deliberate, surgical decision, the way he made all his decisions, efficiently, completely, without room for revision. He had taken everything that remained of his capacity for softness, and he had locked it away in a place so deep inside himself that he had honestly begun to believe it no longer existed. He managed his empire from behind a wall of absolute coldness. He conducted business negotiations with the same calm detachment a man might use to discuss the weather. He had ordered terrible things done to terrible people, and he had done some of those things himself, and his hands, he knew, were permanently stained with a color no amount of soap would ever wash away. He ruled approximately 40% of New York's organized criminal infrastructure, the docks, the construction unions, the private security contracts that covered half of Midtown, the import routes that funneled goods, legal and otherwise, through the 5 boroughs and out into the tributaries of the eastern seaboard. The Moretti family had been a power in this city for 3 generations, and Alessandro had inherited the throne at 24, young by any standard, and had spent 6 years cementing a dominion that his father and grandfather had only dreamed of. He should have felt something about all of it. He no longer did. What he felt on this particular rainy Thursday night was a sharp, grinding exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep, though God knew he didn't sleep enough, and everything to do with the sound currently emanating from somewhere deep in the east wing of the penthouse. A child screaming. Not the ordinary kind, not the protest scream of a toddler denied a cookie or told it was bedtime. This was the scream of a small creature in genuine, profound, existential pain, a sound with jagged edges and no bottom, the kind of sound that burrowed into the bones and stayed there. It had been part of the ambient noise of this apartment for 12 months now, in varying intensities, and Alessandro had never once gotten used to it, and he knew he never would, because the child making it was his son, and the son's pain was his fault, and that was the one truth he could not lock away. The sound of shattering porcelain followed. A crash. Another. The rhythmic, desperate destruction of a 3-year-old who had no other language for what lived inside him. Alessandro pressed his palm flat against the cold window glass and breathed. Heavy footsteps in the corridor. The study door opened without a knock. Only one person in Alessandro's entire world was permitted that particular liberty. And Silvio Conti came into the room at something approaching a jog, which, for a man of his dimensions, was itself an event worth noting. Silvio was 41, built like a refrigerator that had spent its formative years lifting other refrigerators, with a face like a relief map of somewhere mountainous, and a crooked nose that had been broken no fewer than 4 times. He was Alessandro's underboss, his enforcer, and the closest thing to a friend that a man like Alessandro was permitted to have. He was also, at this particular moment, visibly out of breath, and distinctly pale beneath his olive complexion, which told Alessandro everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. Don Moretti. Silvio paused in the doorway, pressing one enormous hand to his sternum. The 7th nanny this month just packed her bags. She's in the foyer with her luggage. Alessandro did not turn from the window. What happened this time? Silvio hesitated. That hesitation, fractional, almost imperceptible, was enough. Alessandro turned. Silvio. The boy got hold of a pair of safety scissors from the art supply cabinet. Silvio said it the way a man reads out a particularly grim section of a legal document. Flatly, quickly, hoping to get through it before the other party's reaction could build. He slashed her arm. Not deep, she'll be fine, but she's threatening a lawsuit and she's already called her lawyer from the foyer. The silence that followed was the kind that had its own specific gravity. Alessandro set his whiskey glass down on the windowsill with a quiet, precise click and turned to face the room fully. He looked at nothing in particular for a long moment. Then he walked to his desk, that great, dark, mahogany fortress of a desk that had once belonged to his grandfather, and opened the top left drawer. Wire $500,000 to her account. His voice was low and absolutely level, the way still water is level just before something immense moves beneath it. Tell her to keep her mouth shut and sign the NDA that Caruso drafted last month. If she talks, if she so much as posts about it on social media, tell her she will leave New York in a body bag. Silvio did not flinch. He had worked for Alessandro for 6 years, and he had heard statements like this enough times to understand that the menace was real and the follow-through was genuine, even when the delivery was as calm as a man reading a grocery list. Understood. And then get Russo on the phone. Tell him I want a full security audit of the East Wing. I want every object in Filippo's playroom that could conceivably be used as a weapon removed and replaced with soft alternatives. Foam, fabric, nothing rigid, nothing with edges. Alessandro pulled the drawer open further, extracting a leather-bound folder. He opened it on the desk and looked at the papers inside. A long, carefully curated list of names, credentials, references, photographs. Nanny candidates. High-end, professional, elite. The last 3 agencies had personally guaranteed their selections before Filippo had run them out inside of 2 weeks. He stared at the list for a long, burning moment. Then he swept the entire folder off the desk with one violent, contemptuous flick of his wrist. Papers exploded across the marble floor in a cascade of careful vetting and wasted effort. I don't need any more of these, he said, and the cold in his voice had cracked, just slightly, just enough to let something raw and jagged underneath show through, the way the ocean sometimes shows its teeth between swells. I don't need crying women who pack up and leave the moment things get difficult. I need someone capable of breaking through my son's walls. Someone who actually understands what pain looks like in a child who can't speak. Someone who... He stopped. He pressed his jaw shut. He picked up his whiskey glass and turned back to the window, where the rain continued its indifferent assault on the city. Fix it, Silvio, he said quietly. Silvio looked at the scattered papers on the floor, then at the rigid line of his Don's shoulders against the window, then at the papers again. He was a practical man, Silvio Conti. He had survived 30 years in this world by knowing when to speak and when to simply go find solutions. I'll make some calls, he said. He left without another word, pulling the study door closed behind him with the careful quietness of a man leaving a room where something fragile, unexpectedly, has turned out not to be entirely broken after all. Alessandro stood alone at the window and listened to his son scream, and said nothing, and felt everything, and showed nothing. And this was the particular hell he had built for himself, and he lived in it, and he did not know how to leave. The morning after the storm, New York smelled like wet asphalt and possibility. Elena Rossi did not own an umbrella. She had owned one, briefly, 3 months ago. A cheerful yellow one she had found at the back of a clearance shelf at a second-hand shop in Queens for $2. But she had left it on the subway somewhere around 34th Street and had not, in the chaos of her life, found the time or the spare $2 to replace it. So when the remnants of last night's downpour persisted into a gloomy, damp Thursday morning, she made the walk from the Queens bus stop to the address Silvio Conti had texted her, with her collar turned up against the chill and her old floral dress pressing damp against her calves. And she told herself that this was fine, that she had survived considerably worse than a wet walk, and that this job, this strange, aristocratic, darkly mysterious job that had been described to her over the phone in terms deliberately vague enough to be alarming, was her best chance to get ahead of the debt that had been chasing her since she turned 19. She was 22 years old, and the debt had been following her for 3 years, like a patient creditor who knew it had all the time in the world. It was not her debt, strictly speaking. The money was owed by St. Agnes Orphanage in the Bronx, the institution that had taken her in at 4 years old, when her parents had died in a car accident on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, and raised her and fed her and given her what passed for a childhood in a building that always needed repairs it couldn't afford and always ran out of heat in February. Mother Agatha, stout, fierce, perpetually exhausted Mother Agatha, with her steel-gray hair and her hands like carved wood, had taken out loans to keep the orphanage running through the economic devastation of recent years. And when Elena had turned 19 and aged out of the system, she had looked at the numbers in the ledger with her own eyes and made a decision that anyone who knew her would have recognized as entirely, characteristically, Elena. She had decided to pay it herself. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because anyone expected it, but because St. Agnes was her home, and the 14 children currently living there were, in the most real and meaningful sense, her brothers and sisters. And Mother Agatha, prickly and difficult as she could be, was the closest thing to a mother Elena had ever known. And Elena Rossi did not abandon the people she loved. This principle had made her life extremely difficult, as principles tend to do. She worked 3 jobs. She had worked 3 jobs consistently for the past 3 years, sleeping 5 hours a night and spending her off hours tutoring neighborhood kids for small fees, mending clothes for the elderly women in her building, cooking for events at the church 2 blocks from her apartment. She was extraordinarily good at stretching nothing into something. She had grown up doing it, and she was, in the accounting of things that mattered, entirely broke. The gap between what she made and what the orphanage owed was still yawning and deep, and it was this gap that had prompted her to answer the ad. Or rather, the discreet word-of-mouth inquiry passed along through a friend of a friend who knew someone in domestic service, for a live-in nanny position with the Moretti family. The pay being offered was obscene by any standard, enough to close the gap significantly. Enough, maybe, if she was careful, to change the entire picture. She had done her research, because Elena Rossi was not a fool. She knew what the Moretti name meant in this city. She knew what kind of man Alessandro Moretti was, or was reputed to be, in the way that people who live in New York and pay attention cannot help knowing these things. His name came up in certain contexts, certain neighborhoods, certain conversations between men who spoke in lowered voices. She knew that 6 nannies before her had walked out of that penthouse in a state of varying degrees of distress. She knew about the little boy, because the woman who had called her on behalf of Silvio Conti had told her, briefly and without detail, that the child was going through something difficult, which was the kind of language people used when the thing being described was considerably larger and more jagged than the words allowed. She knew all of this, and she had still said yes. Because the debt was real, and because she had spent 18 years in an institution full of children in pain, and because, and this was the part she hadn't mentioned to anyone, She genuinely believed, with a conviction that sat in her chest like something warm and unshakable, that there was no child whose walls she could not eventually find a way through. This had been called naive in the past. She preferred to call it faith. Now she stood on Fifth Avenue, outside the Moretti Tower, looking up at its glass and steel face gleaming in the tentative morning light, and she pressed her worn purse to her chest and breathed. She was not, she was very aware, what anyone would describe as the typical candidate for a position in a household like this. She was 5'4" and generously built, the kind of figure that Italian grandmothers in old movies would have called prosperosa with approval, but that the rest of the modern world had given her 22 years of unsolicited commentary about. Her hips were wide and her waist was narrow by comparison, her figure a lush, exaggerated curve that her cheap clothes could never quite contain gracefully. Her face was what her friend Maria called a Renaissance painting face. Strong dark brows over large brown eyes the color of aged honey, a full mouth, a nose with genuine character. Her skin was the warm olive of southern Italian ancestry, and her hair, which she had hastily twisted into a low bun this morning, with the pins not quite winning the battle against the curls, was very dark and very thick, and perpetually threatening to escape whatever she tried to do with it. She looked, she knew, nothing like any of the sleek, professional women whose photographs had been in that leather folder on Alessandro Moretti's desk. She looked like herself, which was the only option she had ever had. The lobby of the Moretti Tower was the kind of space designed to make a person feel small. Soaring ceilings, black marble floors, security personnel in well-cut suits whose eyes tracked her the moment she came through the revolving door. She gave her name to the desk with what she hoped was a confident smile. A private elevator arrived within 90 seconds, operated by a man who said nothing and looked at nothing, and delivered her to the 42nd floor where Silvio Conti was waiting. He was enormous and serious-faced, and she had the immediate sense of a man who was kind somewhere underneath all the iron, the way some rocks have unexpected colors inside when you break them open. He looked her up and down in the frank, assessing way of someone who has been in service to a demanding employer long enough to skip social niceties, and she looked right back at him, and whatever he found in her expression apparently decided something for him, because the corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Miss Rossi," he said, "the Don is waiting." She followed him down a hallway that was longer and more intimidating than any hallway had a right to be, past doors closed on silence, past a window overlooking a city that looked very far below, until they turned into the grand living room and she saw Alessandro Moretti for the first time. He was seated on a massive black leather sofa, one ankle crossed over a knee, a glass of espresso on the table beside him, dressed in a black shirt with the collar open and dark trousers that had been tailored to perfection by someone who understood exactly what they were working with. He was reading something on his phone, but he looked up when she entered, and his eyes, those absolute, lightless black eyes, swept over her with the slow, thorough efficiency of a weapon being sighted. She felt the look like a physical thing, not the way she usually felt men's eyes on her, which was generally accompanied by something that made her want to fold inward, but differently, more like a verdict, less like an insult. Still uncomfortable, still appraising, but with a quality to it that was oddly impersonal, even in its intensity, as though she were being catalogued rather than judged. She squared her shoulders. She kept her chin up. He turned to Silvio. "Is this a joke?" His voice was low, very low, the kind of low that didn't need to be loud to fill a room entirely. "Are you gambling with my son's life? She looks like she'd get out of breath just walking up the stairs. How is she supposed to handle a violent toddler?" The words hit her squarely, the way they were designed to. She felt the flush climb her neck and spread across her cheeks, the hot, familiar shame that 22 years had not taught her to be immune to. But there was something else there too, something that had also been built by those 22 years, that rose up immediately in response, hot and clear and unashamed. She did not let it shake her voice. "With all due respect, Mr. Moretti," she said, and her voice was steady, and she was proud of it. "Being curvy does not make me useless. I grew up in an orphanage, and I raised 20 children with my own 2 hands. I know how to handle deep trauma, something your mountains of cash clearly cannot buy." Silence. Alessandro Moretti looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, in a way that was different from the initial sweep, more direct, more prolonged, carrying an element of surprise that he was clearly not accustomed to feeling. Then, from the far corner of the room, something that sounded like a small freight train launched itself into motion. Filippo Moretti was 3 years old, and he moved like a force of nature. He came out of the far corner of the room with a crystal trophy clutched in both tiny hands. A heavy thing, the kind awarded to men who won things that didn't ultimately matter, and his eyes were bloodshot with the specific, blazing, helpless rage of a child who has been drowning for a year and has never once been thrown a line. His dark hair was disheveled, his small face contorted into an expression of desperate fury, and he was aimed directly at Elena with the focused intent of a missile that had identified its target. Silvio moved first, stepping forward. "Watch out!" he shouted. But he was too slow, and the trajectory was true, and the trophy left Filippo's small hands and caught Elena directly on the temple, glancing off the bone with a sound that was horrible, and Elena staggered backward 1 step. A thin line of crimson opened across her forehead. Alessandro was on his feet. The instinct was not tenderness, it was reflex, the same reflex that had gotten him upright in 100 situations where the variables had suddenly changed. And he was already calculating, already reaching for the right response, already preparing to signal his guards, who stood in the corridor, to come in and remove the boy before he could inflict further damage. But then Elena did something that nobody in this household had done in 12 months. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't back away or freeze or look at Filippo with the fear or anger that everyone else looked at him with. The expressions that confirmed for the little boy that he was exactly as monstrous as the howling thing inside him told him he was. She stood perfectly still for 1 breath. The blood traced a bright line down her temple and along the soft curve of her cheek. And then, slowly, deliberately, without the slightest grace or elegance, with the straightforward, determined awkwardness of a woman who is doing something because it needs to be done and not because anyone is watching, she lowered herself to her knees on the cold marble floor. Her dress bunched around her. Her shoes were sensible and cheap. Her thick arms opened wide, and she tilted her face up toward Filippo with an expression of such unguarded, gentle warmth that it was almost violent in a room that had not known warmth in a very long time. "Oh, my brave little man," she said. Her voice was honeyed and low, threaded through with a warm Italian-American lilt that curved the edges of her words the way good bread curves in the oven. "My forehead hurts a little bit. But I know your poor heart hurts 100 times worse right now, doesn't it?" Filippo stopped. He stood 3 feet from her with his small chest heaving and his small fists clenched at his sides, and he looked at her, at the blood on her face, at the warmth on her face, at the arms open toward him like a harbor, and something happened in him that was visible from across the room, the way weather changes visible. The rage did not leave, not exactly, but something cracked underneath it, and through the crack leaked something much older and much worse. Grief. Bottomless, infantile, inconsolable grief. The grief of a child who watched his world break apart before he had the language to understand what he was seeing. His small body began to shake. For a long, suspended moment, the room held its breath. Then Filippo Moretti walked forward on his small legs, and walked, and collapsed into Elena's arms. The sound he made when she folded him against her chest was not a scream and not a cry, not exactly. It was something underneath both of those things, something rawer and more private, the sound of a grief that had been locked in a chest too small to contain it, finally, finding a door that was open. He sobbed uncontrollably, his tiny fists bunching in the fabric of her floral dress, his face pressed against the soft warmth of her shoulder. And Elena held him. She held him with both arms, firm and complete, rocking him back and forth with the slow, steady rhythm of someone who has held many children through many storms. And she began to hum, soft and low, an old song, an Italian melody that had no specific origin anyone could name, but that everyone from southern Italy seemed to know in their blood. Something about the sea, something about coming home. Alessandro Moretti stood frozen. He stood with his espresso untouched on the table and his phone in his hand, and his black eyes fixed on the scene on the marble floor. And something happened in his chest that he could not immediately classify. It was not an emotion he had experienced in its full form for 2 years. It was not anything he would have permitted, under ordinary circumstances, to move through him the way it was moving through him now, which was without permission and without any apparent regard for his preferences. He watched the bright line of blood on her pale cheek. He watched his son, his silent, violent, unreachable son, dissolve into absolute trust against a stranger's body in the space of 30 seconds. He watched the way her arms held the boy, without any calculation, without any performance, without any apparent awareness that she was doing something extraordinary. The ice cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just cracked. A fracture line appeared in something he had believed was solid, and through it came a feeling like pressure releasing, like a breath taken after a very long time of forgetting to breathe. Silvio, beside him, said nothing. He was a practical man, as has been established, but even practical men can recognize the specific quality of a moment that contains something that will not be undone. Elena rocked Filippo and hummed, and the blood dried slowly on her cheek, and Alessandro stood absolutely still and felt the first thing he had felt, truly felt, in the pit of his chest, without armor, in 2 years. He did not have a name for it yet. He would, eventually. They negotiated the terms in Alessandro's study after Filippo had been settled, which had taken considerably longer than anyone had predicted, because settling Filippo had until this morning been a theoretical concept rather than a practical reality, and the process was new and tentative and had to be approached the way you approach something wild, slowly, with both hands visible. Elena had finally transferred the sleeping child to his cot herself, tucked him in with a blanket and a low, murmured phrase in Italian that Alessandro, watching from the doorway, could not quite hear. And then she had washed the blood from her face at the hallway bathroom sink with the businesslike efficiency of someone who has dealt with worse. And she had followed Silvio to the study without being asked, which told Alessandro something about her. She sat in the chair across from his desk. It was a chair that most people perched on when they sat in it, sat forward, sat carefully, sat in a way that acknowledged its significance in the room's hierarchy. Elena leaned back in it. Not insolently, not performing relaxation she didn't feel, but genuinely, the way a person sits when they are tired and have decided that pretending otherwise requires energy they don't have. He studied her. He did this openly, without any attempt at subtlety, because subtlety in the service of politeness had never been a quality he cultivated. She had a thin red mark on her temple that was going to be a bruise by evening. The blood had left a faint ghost on her cheek despite the washing. Her hair was escaping its pins with renewed determination. Her dress was slightly damp at the hem from her walk, and her purse, which she had set beside her feet, as though she couldn't quite bring herself to put it down entirely, was the kind of purse that said, in its worn seams and careful repair, everything about her financial situation without requiring any additional explanation. And yet she looked at him. Directly, without flinching, without the specific species of anxiety that most people brought into this room when they sat across from him. Not fearless. He didn't think she was fearless, because fearless and stupid were frequently related, and she was clearly not stupid, but squared up, present. Meeting him as though she were his equal, and had simply decided to proceed on that assumption. He found it, unexpectedly and inconveniently, interesting. "Tell me about the orphanage," he said. She didn't look surprised by the non sequitur. "St. Agnes, in the Bronx. I've lived there since I was 4. I aged out at 19, but I still help as much as I can." A pause. "Mother Agatha has been running it for 25 years. She's the most stubborn woman I've ever met, and I grew up in a building full of children with nothing to lose, so that's saying something. 20 children. Currently 14, but over the years, yes, I've been involved in raising approximately 20 kids through various stages of difficult. I know what trauma looks like in a child. I know what it smells like, what it sounds like, how it moves." She met his gaze evenly. "Your son is grieving. He lost his mother, and he doesn't have the words for what happened, so he's expressing it the only way his nervous system knows how. He's not broken. He's bereaved. Alessandro's jaw tightened. It was the only external indicator of the thing that moved through him at the word mother. You know nothing about what happened. I know what I saw, she said quietly. I know what I felt when I held him. That's enough for now. A silence. Outside the window, New York hummed its endless, indifferent hum. The salary, he said, changing the course deliberately, is $12,000 a month. He watched her absorb that number, watched the brief, involuntary flicker of something, relief, disbelief, cross her face before she brought it back to stillness. That's more than, it is what it is. In addition, you'll have your own suite on the residential floor, meals, of course, a car and driver available around the clock, full medical coverage. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the desk, his voice lowering by a fraction. In exchange, you do not leave. You do not resign without 90 days' notice. You do not discuss this household with anyone outside these walls. You do not take Filippo off the premises without my explicit authorization. And you, he paused, choosing words with the precision of a surgeon choosing instruments, stay out of my way. She looked at him for a long moment. I have one condition of my own, she said. He raised an eyebrow. 1 degree. People did not typically offer conditions in this room. Go ahead. You spend 1 hour with him each week. With Filippo. Not managing him, not supervising him. Actually present. On the floor, at his level, doing whatever he wants to do. She held his gaze. Children need their fathers. And from what I've seen this morning, he needs his quite badly. The silence that followed was so complete and so specific that it had a shape. Alessandro looked at her. He looked at this young woman with the bruise forming on her temple, and the escaped curls and the worn-down purse and the unbowed spine, who had walked into his house and held his son and was now telling him, with perfect composure and complete seriousness, what to do. He should have dismissed her. He should have had Silvio show her out and found someone more compliant, more professional, more appropriate to the position. He recognized this as the rational course of action, and he found himself doing none of it. 1 hour, he said, on your schedule. She nodded once. Then I accept. They shook hands across the great dark desk. Her hand was warm. His was scarred. She looked down at the handshake briefly, then back up at him, and he saw something flicker in her honey-brown eyes that was gone before he could name it. One more thing, she said, as Silvio came forward to collect her paperwork. Is there a good kitchen in this place? Because Filippo is going to need routine, and routine starts with food, and I intend to cook. Silvio made a sound that might, in a man less reserved, have been a laugh. Alessandro said nothing. But something very small, very far inside the locked place in his chest, shifted, like a compass needle reorienting toward a source of warmth. He dismissed himself from the room before he could think about it further. 1 week passed, then 2. The Moretti penthouse, which had existed for the past year as a kind of beautiful, gilded disaster, all the aesthetic of wealth and power wrapped around the chaos of a grieving household, began, almost imperceptibly, to change. It started in the kitchen. Elena had identified the kitchen on her first full day as the strategic center of her campaign, which was the word she used internally, campaign, because that was what it felt like, this careful, patient work of establishing trust with a child who had none left to give. The kitchen was large and Italian in its bones, despite its modern finishes. An industrial range, a marble island the size of a small country, copper pots hanging from a rack overhead that had clearly not been used in some time, given the thin film of disuse on their surfaces. She set about restoring it to working order with quiet, purposeful energy. On the first morning, she made soft polenta with a gentle cheese sauce, because Filippo's file, which Silvio had provided in a thick folder that Elena had read 3 times, cover to cover, learning her charge's history the way a general studies terrain before advancing, noted that he had refused all foods with complex textures since the previous year. She put the bowl in front of him at the kitchen table and sat across from him and ate her own breakfast in peaceable silence, and did not once make an issue of whether he ate or didn't. He ate half of it, then more. By the end of the first week, she had reintroduced 4 foods he had previously rejected. She had also established a morning routine: breakfast at 7, a short walk on the terrace at 9, a period of art materials, soft ones as Alessandro had instructed, watercolors and modeling clay and fat crayons, at 10, lunch at noon, that Filippo was beginning, tentatively, to anticipate. He did not speak. His silence was total and consistent, a wall he had built between himself and a world that had proven itself unsafe, and Elena did not press against it. She spoke to him constantly, explaining what she was doing, narrating their day, telling him the names of things, reading aloud from the Italian picture books she had found in his room, and she trusted that the words were landing even if none came back. She was right, though no one knew it yet. The household staff watched her with increasing interest. The Moretti penthouse operated on a skeleton crew of trusted personnel, a security team managed by a man named Bruno, who had arms like structural beams and a surprisingly gentle disposition, a housekeeper named Concetta, who had been with the family since Alessandro's father's time, and who had largely mothered the entire staff for 20 years, a driver and a chef, the chef having been dismissed in the current household crisis and not yet replaced, which was why Elena's kitchen occupation had gone uncontested. These were not soft people. They had seen things in this household and in this world that had burned away any tendency toward sentimentality years ago. They were not prepared for Elena Rossi. By the end of the second week, she was cooking for all of them. Great, fragrant, embarrassingly good meals that filled the apartment with scents that none of the staff had smelled since the last time someone had actually cared enough to make a home of this place rather than a fortress. Slow-braised ossobuco. Fresh pasta rolled out on the marble island, cut by hand, tossed in a sauce that Concetta, who was from Napoli and had opinions, declared was the finest she had tasted since her mother's table. Cannoli, whose filling Elena made from scratch because she had learned from an elderly woman in the Bronx who had learned from her grandmother in Sicily. And that kind of knowledge did not come in packages. The hitmen, Alessandro's security detail, men who had performed acts of significant violence in this city's service and generally expressed emotion at the level of carved stone, began to show up in the kitchen on their off rotations. Bruno, the head of security, told Elena one evening that the last time that kitchen had smelled like that, the Don's wife had been alive. He said it simply, without much apparent affect, but the sentence sat between them with considerable weight. What was she like? Elena asked. She was rolling dough. She did not look up. Bruno considered. Beautiful, he said, in the way that things are beautiful when they're dangerous. Very precise. She was precise, demanded things exactly so. He paused. The Don loved her. And now? Elena asked. Bruno looked at her steadily. He was not, she thought, a man who spoke carelessly. Now, he said, he doesn't love anything, except Filippo, and he doesn't know how to show it. Elena was quiet for a moment, pressing her palms into the dough. People learn, she said finally. It just takes practice. Bruno looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression of a man encountering something he did not expect to encounter, and then he went back to his post without another word. Alessandro himself was a presence she mostly experienced indirectly in these first weeks. She heard him in the mornings, the spare, early sounds of a man who rarely slept past 5, the faint ring of his phone, the low cadence of business conducted in Italian or English with equal flat efficiency. She saw the evidence of his movements, the espresso cup left on the kitchen counter before she was up, the light on in the study when she came back from settling Filippo for the night, the crisp, expensive scent of him that lingered in hallways like something she had to deliberately stop noticing. He was in the apartment, and he was not in the apartment, both at once. A ghost of himself, inhabiting the periphery of a household that was slowly, without his participation, coming back to life. But twice in those first 2 weeks, she came around a corner or a doorway and found him watching. Standing in the kitchen doorway while she and Filippo painted at the table, saying nothing, his face arranged in its habitual stoniness, but his eyes alive with something complex and unresolved. Standing in the corridor outside Filippo's room at 8 in the evening, when she was putting the boy to bed, the door cracked, the sound of her Italian lullaby drifting through. Both times, when he saw that she had noticed him, he left without a word. She did not push. She was patient by nature and strategic by necessity, and she understood. She understood in the way you understand things you have lived rather than learned, that a man standing in a doorway, watching something warm, is a man who wants to be part of it but doesn't know if he has permission. She would have to find a way to give him permission. But that, she thought, tucking Filippo's small warm weight into his blankets and watching his breathing even into sleep, was a project for another week. The first hour happened on a Tuesday. Alessandro came to the kitchen at 10 in the morning, which was a significant departure from his established routine of existing exclusively in his study, his home office, and the dining room, and never in the spaces Elena had colonized. And he stood in the doorway as he sometimes did, except this time he did not leave when she looked up. She was sitting on the kitchen floor with Filippo. They had spread a large piece of butcher paper across the tiles, and Filippo was painting on it with his hands, which was a technique Elena had introduced the previous week, and which had produced the first sustained period of calm she had observed in the boy. There was something about the direct sensory contact with the paint, the way it spread under his palms, that seemed to bypass whatever kept short-circuiting his nervous system and reach something quieter underneath. His hands were blue and green and red. He was not speaking, but he was not screaming either. He was here, present in this room, engaged with this activity, and that was an achievement that could not be overstated. Elena looked up from the floor at Alessandro in the doorway and said, simply, "Good morning. Come sit down." He looked at the floor. He looked at the butcher paper. He looked at Filippo, who had not yet registered his father's arrival. He looked at Elena, who was watching him with calm expectation, with the expression of someone who has issued an instruction and is entirely prepared to wait for compliance. "Sit down," she said again. "You said 1 hour." A long pause. Then Alessandro Moretti, in his dark trousers and his immaculate shirt, lowered himself to the kitchen floor. He sat cross-legged beside his son, at Filippo's level, the way she had asked. It was clear this was not a position he occupied often. It was clear, from the careful way he arranged himself, from the slight stiffness around his jaw, that he was outside his territory entirely and was not entirely sure of the protocols. Elena dipped her own hand into the red paint and made a broad mark across the paper. She did not look at either of them. She hummed, low and absent, as she did when she was doing something with her hands. Filippo worked his way slowly down the paper, absorbed. Then he stopped. Then, with the careful periphery awareness of a child who tracks changes in the room more acutely than any adult, he looked up. He looked at his father. Alessandro looked back. The moment stretched between them, father and son, a year of silence and distance and grief and the desperate inadequacy of love that doesn't know how to perform itself. And Elena kept her eyes on the paper and kept humming and pretended to be entirely absorbed in the red handprint she was making, while everything that mattered in the room happened in the 6 inches of space between a man on the floor and his small, watchful son. Filippo dipped his hand in the blue paint. He reached across and pressed his small, blue handprint directly onto his father's expensive shirt, over the center of his chest. Elena stopped humming. Alessandro looked down at the blue handprint on his shirt. He was very still. His face was doing something complex and private, the architecture of it shifting in ways she imagined it rarely shifted in front of other people. Then he dipped his own hand in the red paint and pressed it to the paper next to Filippo's blue ones. Filippo looked at the red handprint, looked at his father, and then did something Elena had not heard him do since she arrived in this apartment. He laughed. It was small. It was brief. It was barely more than a huff of surprised delight. But it was real, and it was his, and it was the first one, and Elena felt the back of her eyes burn, and blinked very hard, and went back to her own section of paper, and did not make anything of it out loud, because making things of moments too quickly was how you killed them. Alessandro sat on the kitchen floor for the full hour. He did not speak. He had no more idea than Filippo how to break the silence between them, and Elena did not coach him in words, because this was not the right entry point. But he was there, present, physically present, in his son's space, at his son's level, and she watched over the course of that hour the extraordinary, unglamorous, essential work of 2 people beginning to find each other again. After the hour, when Filippo had been set up with watercolors at the table and was absorbed in a new project, Alessandro stood and came to the sink where Elena was washing paint from her hands. He stood beside her and ran the water over his own paint-covered hand, and for a moment they were just two people washing paint off their skin in a quiet kitchen. He laughed, Alessandro said. His voice was very low and flat, but she heard what lived in it. Yes, she said. He hasn't laughed since... He stopped. I know, she said. Another silence. The water ran between them. Same time next week? She said, without looking at him. A pause so long she almost repeated the question. Same time next week, Alessandro Moretti said. 4 weeks in, the Moretti penthouse smelled different. It was the first thing people noticed when they arrived for business. And people arrived for business regularly, at all hours, men in expensive suits who spoke in low voices and left without making eye contact with household staff. They came into the hallway and they paused, infinitesimally, because the air was threaded through with something warm, vanilla and cinnamon, slow braised tomatoes, fresh bread from the oven, the ghost of sweet milk from Filippo's afternoon snack, the scent of a life being lived in a place that had previously only been a location. Alessandro noticed it every time he came home. He would return from a meeting in the city, from the sort of meeting where voices were raised and men were reminded of consequences, the machinery of his empire grinding away, and he would come through the private elevator into the foyer and be met by that smell, and something in him that had been knotted through the whole long day would loosen, just slightly. He told himself it meant nothing. It was on a Tuesday evening, 5 weeks into her tenure, that the particular crisis of the kitchen occurred. He had come home later than expected, a situation with the Calabrian distributors that had required 3 hours of his specific attention and had sent 2 men to their knees and resolved nothing permanently, but had at least resolved it for tonight. And the apartment was quiet in the way it was quiet after Filippo was asleep and the staff had rotated to their off shifts. He expected to find the kitchen empty. He found Elena. She was baking. That was the benign, factual description of what was happening, and it was entirely accurate, and it failed completely to capture the experience of the room. She was at the marble island, kneading dough, and she had not heard him come in. Her hair was down for the first time he had seen it, tumbling in thick, dark waves past her shoulders, pushed back from her face with a careless hand that had left a trace of flour on her cheekbone. She was wearing a plain white button-up shirt and a skirt that ended below the knee, and the apron tied around her narrow waist put her figure in a particular relief that he was not going to think about, and her eyes were half closed in the absent, absorbed expression of someone doing something their body knows how to do without their mind being fully required. She was humming, the same melody, the one he had come to think of as hers, the lullaby, the old Italian thing that had no name he knew. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He told himself he should announce his presence or walk away. He did neither. He stood in the doorway and watched her, and the smell of vanilla was thick around him, and the lullaby was in the air, and something he had been working very hard to suppress for several weeks now was pushing against the walls of its containment with increased insistence. She was beautiful. He had noticed this in the clinical way he noticed things, had catalogued it in that first assessment, had noted the strong, dark brows and the honey eyes and the warm olive skin and the full, expressive mouth. He had noted it and filed it under irrelevant and moved on, because she was his son's caregiver and not a complication he needed, and he was not. He had decided 2 years ago, going to be the kind of man who let beauty undo him again. But beauty was one thing, and this was something more than beauty, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to classify and therefore to contain. It was the warmth. The warmth was the problem. Elena Rossi had the kind of warmth that radiated from a person the way heat radiates from stone on a summer evening. You could feel it from across the room, and if you stood close to it long enough, it began to undo the chill in your bones that you had stopped noticing was there. He had been cold for 2 years. He had been cold, and he had been competent, and he had run his empire and raised his son, or attempted to raise his son, or at least maintained custody of a situation he couldn't solve. And he had told himself that the coldness was a preference and not an absence. Standing in the kitchen doorway at 10:30 on a Tuesday evening, watching her knead dough and hum to herself, he understood that it was an absence, and that the absence had an exact shape, and that shape fit her. He moved into the kitchen before he had consciously decided to. He moved behind her, across the kitchen, to the marble island where she was working, and he did not think about what he was doing with any of the usual analytical precision he brought to everything he did. He simply moved, drawn by something that bypassed analysis entirely, something more primal and more honest than anything he had permitted himself in a very long time. He stopped behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. He was a large man, and he ran hot, always had. Close enough that when she breathed in, she would get his scent alongside the vanilla. She went still. Her hands stopped in the dough. He heard the small, involuntary catch of her breath. He put one large, scarred hand at her waist, curving around the apron strings, feeling the warmth of her through the fabric, the soft, real, wonderful warmth of her. And he pulled her, gently but without ambiguity, completely without ambiguity, flush back against his chest. "Mr. Moretti," her voice came out unsteady, higher than usual, the honeyed accent more pronounced under the pressure of whatever was happening in her chest. "Please, let me go. I am just the nanny." He pressed his face into the curve of her neck and shoulder. He breathed her in. The scent of her hit him, vanilla and warm skin, and something underneath that was just hers, just Elena, some particular combination of the world she carried with her. And he felt it land in him like a stone dropped into still water, sending rings out from the center of his chest in all directions. "You are Filippo's nanny, Elena." His voice came out rougher than he intended, rougher than it usually was, stripped of the careful calibration he put on his voice the way he put on everything else. "But you are my beautiful poison. Watching you wear these thin, tight dresses while serving my men makes me want to tear the fabric from your body and lock you away in my bedroom where no one else can ever look at you." She made a sound, not a protest exactly, or not only a protest, something more complicated, something that lived in the same breath as fear and want and confusion, the specific, vertigo-inducing mixture of those things when they arrived together. He turned her. He turned her with his hands at her waist, spinning her to face him, and he tilted her chin up with one scarred finger, and he looked down into her face, the flower on her cheek, the wide, honey-brown eyes, the full lips slightly parted, and his eyes burned with something that had been banked for 2 years and was now, without warning, afire. He leaned down. He was 2 inches from her mouth when... Knock, 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 ... "Boss." Silvio's voice, muffled through the kitchen door, carrying the specific timbre it took on when the news was bad. "Emergency. I'm sorry to interrupt, but this cannot wait." Alessandro closed his eyes. He held the position, Elena's chin in his finger, her face upturned toward his, both of them breathing the same air, for precisely 4 more seconds. Then he stepped back. His face had gone back to stone. Whatever had been briefly, dangerously visible in it was gone, locked away behind the usual fortifications, and only his eyes, which he could not entirely discipline, still held the heat of it. "What is it?" he said to the door. Silvio opened it. He looked at the 2 of them and took in the scene, and his face gave nothing away, which was a professional achievement of considerable distinction. "The Moroni cartel," he said. "They found out about Miss Rossi." He paused. "And they've made a move." The information Silvio delivered in the kitchen that night spread through Alessandro's chest like ice water poured into a wound that was still warm. The Moroni cartel, the Sicilian-American outfit that had been the Moretti family's primary rival for 12 years, currently under the control of a man named Matteo Moroni, who was the son of Alessandro's father's old enemy and had inherited both the organization and the personal vendetta along with it, had spent the past several weeks conducting what amounted to a background investigation of Alessandro's household. This was not unusual in the world they occupied. Rivals gathered intelligence as a matter of routine practice, and the intelligence teams on both sides of any rivalry were always at work. What was unusual, what was, in fact, an escalation significant enough to qualify as a declaration of intent, was what they had done with what they found. Mother Agatha had been taken. The call had come to Silvio's secondary phone an hour ago. A voice he had identified as belonging to one of Moroni's lieutenants had delivered the information economically. The elderly woman who ran St. Agnes Orphanage in the Bronx was currently a guest of the Moroni organization at a location to be specified. She would remain a guest until Alessandro Moretti delivered a complete security grid layout of the Moretti properties, residential, commercial, and operational, to a rendezvous point at the Brooklyn docks at midnight the following night. The voice had also delivered one additional piece of information as a demonstration of intelligence: the name Elena Rossi, and the suggestion that Alessandro's apparent attachment to his son's new nanny represented a vulnerability that the Moroni cartel found professionally interesting. Alessandro listened to Silvio's account with complete stillness. He did not interrupt. He did not react visibly. He was very, very still in the way that certain bodies of water are very still before they break. Behind him, Elena had said nothing. He turned to look at her. Her face had gone pale. Not the pale of fear for herself, but the specific pale of someone who has received news about a person they love. Her hands were pressed flat on the marble island. Her jaw was set. "She's 71 years old," Elena said. Her voice was steady, but it was taking visible effort to keep it that way. "She has a heart condition. If they frighten her—" "She will not be harmed," Alessandro said. He said it flatly, conclusively, as a statement of fact rather than a hope, because there were very few things he could not control in this world, and he had decided, in this instant, that this was not going to be one of them. He turned to Silvio. "Get me everything we have on Moroni's current operational footprint at the Brooklyn docks. I want the layout, the guard rotations, the access points. I want it in 2 hours." Silvio nodded and left the room. Alessandro turned back to Elena. She was still looking at him with those honey-brown eyes, and what he saw in them was not the thing he expected. Not panic, not recrimination, not the particular expression of a woman realizing she had underestimated the cost of being in proximity to him. What he saw was determination, and a specific, calcified kind of grief. And underneath both of those things, something that looked dangerously like loyalty. "Alessandro," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without the title. Neither of them acknowledged it. "She's the only mother I've ever had." "I know," he said. "I'll go to the meeting." "No. She won't trust anyone else." "Elena." His voice dropped to its lowest register, and she heard the quality in it that was not a request. "You will not go to that meeting. I will handle this." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that suggested she was running an internal debate between her instinct to push back and her instinct to trust him. He watched her make the decision. He watched it happen in her face, the subtle surrender of one argument to another, and he felt something shift in him at the sight of it. She was trusting him, genuinely trusting him, and he understood that was not something she offered easily. "I need to tell you something," she said. "About the orphanage, about the debt." "I know about the debt," he said. She stared at him. "I had Silvio pull the financial situation 3 days after you arrived," he said. "It's been handled." "What do you mean, handled?" "The loans have been paid. The orphanage's accounts are solvent. St. Agnes will operate for the next 20 years on the foundation I've established for it, if it's managed reasonably." He said it the way he said most things, evenly, without editorializing, without any apparent expectation that she would be overwhelmed. "Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I've done something unexpected. It was a practical matter." She did not say anything for a very long time. Her throat worked. Her eyes were bright, and she blinked, and she pressed her lips together, and he watched her refuse to cry in his kitchen, with the same set-shouldered refusal she had brought to every hard thing he had observed her face since she arrived. "Alessandro," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Go to bed," he said, not unkindly. "I have work to do. Mother Agatha will be home before she has a chance to be frightened. I promise you this." She looked at him. She looked at him for one long, searching, unguarded moment, as though she were trying to find the lie in it and couldn't. "Okay," she said quietly. She left the kitchen. He turned back to the window, already running the variables, already building the architecture of what needed to happen tonight and tomorrow and at the Brooklyn docks at midnight. He was very good at this. He was excellent at this. He had been excellent at strategy and violence for his entire adult life, and it had made him powerful and left him empty. But right now the power was useful, and he was going to use every atom of it. He thought about her face when he'd said the debt was handled. He thought about the brightness in her eyes and the set of her jaw and the way she said his name. He turned his attention back to the strategy. He would think about the rest later. Midnight at the Brooklyn docks. The storm had come back, or perhaps a new one had arrived. It didn't matter. The effect was the same. Rain fell in heavy, directed sheets off the harbor, and the wind off the water was cold and salt-smelling and mean. And the industrial architecture of the waterfront, the container cranes, the corrugated walls of warehouses, the rusted anatomy of working infrastructure, absorbed all of it without complaint, as objects built for function rather than elegance always do. But Elena was not in the safe room of the Moretti penthouse where Alessandro had left her. She had waited 3 hours. She had sat in the safe room behind its reinforced door, and she had told herself she was going to trust him, had told herself that he was capable and she should stay. And then she had thought about Mother Agatha, 71 years old, that bad heart, the rosary she always worried through her fingers when she was anxious, and she had made a different calculation. She had taken a fake USB drive she'd constructed from a non-functional one in Alessandro's home office supply drawer. She had called the contact number Silvio had given her for emergency communication, and she had told the man who answered, in precise and unhesitating terms, exactly what she was doing and where she was going, and she had disconnected before he could stop her. She had gone to the docks. The warehouse smelled of diesel and salt water and something else, something organic and uneasy. It was lit by a handful of work lights that cast long shadows and made the space look like the inside of something that had been hollow for a long time. Elena stood in the center of it with her purse and her coat and the fake USB in her hand, and she tried to look like a woman who had things under control. She did not feel like a woman who had things under control. From the shadows, he emerged. Matteo Moroni was 45 and compact, and moved like something that had learned cruelty early and made a discipline of it. His face was the face of someone who found the world's pain amusing. He had 2 men flanking him and 2 more behind Elena, which she had not heard arrive, and he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been given exactly what he wanted and is deciding whether to be magnanimous about it. "So the rumors are true," he said, coming toward her with his hands in his pockets, his voice carrying that particular quality of forced pleasantry that people use when pleasantry is a mask for contempt. "The Ice King likes his toys with a little extra meat on them." He tilted his head, looking her over with frank, ugly appraisal. "I have to admit, you have an incredibly seductive face, and the body—" He reached out, and Elena stepped back, and his hand followed. The south wall of the warehouse ceased to exist. That was the only accurate description. It ceased to exist, obliterated by the impact of a Rolls-Royce Phantom that had been accelerated by a driver named Luca to a speed that turned the vehicle into a battering ram, and the steel doors went off their hinges and across the warehouse floor, and through the hole where the wall had been, preceded by the headlights and the screaming of tires, came Alessandro Moretti. He stepped out of the car while it was still rocking on its suspension. He wore a long black trench coat that the harbor wind caught and billowed behind him like a cape, or like the wings of something very old and very dangerous, and in his hands was a tactical rifle that he held with the comfort of a man who learned firearms before he learned to drive. His eyes, those absolute black eyes, found Elena first, found her standing and unharmed, and then moved to Matteo with an expression that had nothing theatrical in it at all. It was simply the expression of a man who has made a decision and is implementing it. Behind him, 4 cars, 12 men minimum, all armed. "Touch a single hair on her head," Alessandro said, and his voice carried in the wind without being raised, the way a certain kind of authority carries without effort, "and I will erase your entire bloodline from this city." Matteo had the sense to recognize that he had miscalculated the variables significantly. He did not, unfortunately, have the sense to stop, because men like Matteo Moroni did not know how to stop, because stopping required an acknowledgement of defeat that their psychology could not accommodate. What followed was brief and brutal and entirely one-sided. Alessandra's men moved in a coordinated pattern through the warehouse that spoke of preparation and practice. The Moroni contingent was caught in an enclosed space with superior numbers against them and the tactical disadvantage of a surprise entry, and they responded the way cornered men respond, which was badly and without effective coordination. It lasted 4 minutes. Alessandra moved through it the way Elena would forever after describe in her memory as terrifyingly beautiful. Not beautiful in any way she could feel comfortable about, but beautiful in the way that extreme competence is always slightly vertiginous to observe, even when the competence is being applied to terrible purposes. He was extraordinary. He was also, she understood watching him move, genuinely lethal in a way that had, until this moment, been abstract information. Matteo retreated behind an overturned crate. His 2 remaining men were down. He had 1 gun and 1 play left, and he took it. He aimed across the warehouse at Elena. She saw it in the half-second before it happened. She saw him sight her, saw the calculation in his eyes, saw the particular quality of intent that preceded the irreversible act. She had just enough time to understand what was about to occur, and not enough time to do anything about it. "Elena!" Alessandro moved. He was 15 feet from her, and he covered it in the time between a breath and a heartbeat, and he turned his body toward her, and the shot that Matteo fired hit him in the left shoulder and drove him into her, and they went down together, hard, onto the wet concrete. The crack of the weapon, the weight of him, his blood, immediate and shocking, a dark spray across her face and neck, and then his weight on her, his full, solid, substantial weight, and his face above hers, pale now, pale with sudden blood loss, but his eyes absolutely open and absolutely present. The shooting stopped. Someone was shouting in Italian, feet on the concrete. Elena had both hands pressed to his shoulder, already, instinctively, applying pressure, and she was crying. She didn't know when she had started, and the tears were mixing with his blood on her face, and she could feel him breathing, hard and fast, but breathing, and she said his name over and over, "Alessandro, Alessandro, Alessandro," and he looked at her with those black eyes that were, for the first time, entirely unguarded. "I told you," he managed, "to stay in the safe room." She laughed. It was the only thing in the world she could do. It came out somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and it didn't matter, and he was alive, and that was the entire universe. "Mother Agatha," she said. "She's in the second car," he said. "She's fine. She's angry, but she's fine." He closed his eyes briefly, as expected. Silvio was at his side. Luca was shouting for the car. The warehouse was full of controlled, efficient movement. Alessandro's people cleaning up their situation with the competence she would come to understand was characteristic. She kept her hands on his shoulder. She kept the pressure. He kept his eyes on her face. "We're going home," she said. "Yes," he said. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like the word home meant the same thing to both of them, which, she realized, with her hands red with his blood, and her face wet with her tears, and the harbor wind cold and salt-bitter around them, it was beginning to. The master bedroom of the Moretti penthouse was a room Elena had never entered. It occupied the northern corner of the residential floor, and she had understood without being told that it was a boundary, not a hostile one, not marked with any explicit prohibition, but present nonetheless, the way certain silences are present in conversations where everyone understands what is not being said. It was his room, his private territory, the inner sanctum of whatever remained of the man behind the dawn. She entered it now with his blood on her hands, and her heart still hammering from the docks, and she did not have time to absorb the room's details, because the details were not what mattered. What mattered was getting him onto the bed and keeping pressure on the wound until the medical team arrived. Dr. Ferrara was the Moretti family's physician, a spare, precise man in his 50s who had apparently been treating the consequences of Alessandro's profession for the better part of a decade without complaint and without unnecessary questions, and who arrived at the penthouse within 20 minutes with a case that turned out to contain considerably more surgical equipment than a standard house call. He removed the bullet from Alessandra's shoulder with practiced efficiency, administered local anesthetic and antibiotics and the other chemical necessities, and stitched the wound with the concentration of someone doing work they have done before and consider adequately challenging. Elena watched from the side of the room during this process, with her arms folded around herself and her coat still on, and the rust-dried traces of his blood still on her face because she had not had a moment to wash it. Dr. Ferrara, on his way out, paused beside her. "He'll heal well," he said quietly. "The shoulder is not critical. He's had worse." He looked at her face and the blood on it, and something in his expression softened very slightly, the professional courtesy yielding briefly to something more human. "Clean up," he said. "He'll be all right." She went to the ensuite bathroom and washed her face and her hands and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The bruise from Filippo's trophy, nearly faded now, the tear tracks on her cheeks, her own wide eyes looking back at her with an expression of someone still processing what they have just lived through. Alessandro was conscious when she came back. He was lying against the headboard of the great, dark bed, a massive thing, black linens, austere, the bed of a man who slept as a functional necessity rather than as a pleasure, pale but present, his left shoulder heavily bandaged, his eyes following her across the room. She sat on the edge of the mattress beside him. She had a bowl of warm water and a cloth, the specific domestic instinct for caretaking over the moment the immediate crisis had passed, and she began to clean his good hand, the right one, which had blood on the knuckles from the brief combat at the docks, old blood and new. "Why did you do that?" she said. She asked it quietly, not an accusation, a genuine question, asked with the directness of someone who has stopped pretending they don't need the answer. He looked at her. "Why would you take a bullet for me?" she continued, the cloth moving over his knuckles in careful circles. "I'm just a—" She stopped. She exhaled. "I'm a broke girl from the Bronx. I'm your son's nanny. My life isn't worth—" "Stop." She looked up. "Stop." His voice was not angry. It was something else, quieter than anger, more urgent, carrying a quality of feeling that she had never heard from him before, raw and unfiltered and very close to the surface. He was looking at her with those black eyes, and the black eyes were full of something that had nothing cold in it at all. He moved. He moved with the arm that wasn't in bandages, the good one, reaching for her, and she let him take her wrist, and he pulled. Not violently, but with intent, with unmistakable intent. And she came forward, and his arm went around her, and she found herself lying against him, her face on his chest, her body against his heartbeat under her ear, strong and steady and real. She should have gotten up. She made a calculation about this and concluded, with the strange clarity that follows extreme fear, that she did not actually want to. "To the rest of the world," he said, his voice a low rumble under her ear, "I am a monster. I know exactly what I am and what I have done, and I have not spent any significant time lying to myself about it. The blood on my hands is real. The things I have done to maintain this empire—" He paused. She felt his chest rise and fall. "The world's judgment of me is not inaccurate." She waited. "But to me," he continued, and his arm tightened around her, not painfully, but completely, "you are my only salvation. The blind, superficial world outside these walls has never meant anything to me. The things they measure and the standards they use to measure them, none of it has ever seemed real in any way that matters. Every soft, perfect, beautiful inch of you is the only sanctuary I have found in 2 years where the things I carry can be set down, even briefly." She was very still. Her breath was even and deliberate. "I don't want a nanny anymore," he said. His voice had dropped so low she had to concentrate to hear it, and the concentration was not a difficulty because she was attending to every syllable with her entire body. "I want a Donna. I want a wife. I want you in this apartment, and in my life, and in my bed, for the rest of whatever is left of it. And if you try to run from me, I will burn this city to the ground, just to find you and bring you back." She lifted her head from his chest and looked at him. He was pale and bandaged, and his jaw was set in that characteristic way that was half stubbornness and half the need to control his face, and his eyes were doing nothing of the sort. His eyes were open and undefended and entirely, devastatingly honest. "I have been cold," he said, "for 2 years. I chose it as a way to survive, and it worked, and now I want to be done with it." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the kitchen doorway, the hour on the floor, the blue handprint on his chest. She thought about the debt, paid without announcement, without a word to her. She thought about the docks, his body between her and the bullet, his blood on her face. She thought about a man standing in a doorway, watching something warm, not knowing if he had permission to enter. "I won't run," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I won't run, my beautiful devil." She pulled him down, gently, mindful of his shoulder, but without hesitation, without equivocation, with the directness that was her particular quality, and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not a tentative first kiss, the kind that asks a question. It was the kind that answers one, the kind that arrives after a long wait and does not waste any more time. His good hand came up to cup her face, rough against her soft skin, and she held his jaw in both of her hands, and the kiss was fierce and warm and tasted of grief and relief and something that was not either of those things but contained them both. Outside, New York hummed its endless hum. Somewhere down the corridor, Filippo slept. Inside the master bedroom, the Ice King finally, completely, and without reservation, melted. Morning came in through the bedroom windows in long, gold-colored columns. Elena woke to the sound of the city 50 stories below and the warmth of him behind her, and spent approximately 4 seconds in the pleasant, soft confusion of not quite remembering, before the full weight of the previous night landed on her at once. The docks, the gun, the blood, the confession, the kiss, and she was entirely awake. She was careful getting up. His shoulder. She moved with the slow, deliberate caution of someone extracting themselves from a position they don't want to damage, and she stood beside the bed and looked down at him in the early light. He was asleep. She had never seen him sleep before. She realized, now, that she had constructed an elaborate private theory that he didn't actually sleep, that he simply stood at windows until morning and then moved efficiently through his day. The reality, him on his side, his dark hair slightly disordered, his face without the mask of its usual iron composure, his shoulder bandaged, one hand open on the pillow where she had been, was so unexpectedly ordinary and so unexpectedly tender that she stood looking at it longer than she meant to. He was 30 years old, and he had lived a life that would have crushed other people, and somewhere underneath all of it, he still had the face of the person he had been before things got hard, and that face was, she could say this to herself, privately, in the gold morning light, beautiful. She went to check on Filippo. He was already awake when she came in, sitting up in bed with his hair in his eyes and his stuffed elephant under one arm, looking at the door with an expression that had become, over the past weeks, recognizable to her. He had known she was coming before she arrived. He had begun to do this consistently, this anticipatory quietness, as though her patterns had become part of his internal landscape, as though he had mapped her the way you map the places you feel safe. It broke her heart in the very best way. She sat on the edge of his bed and pushed his hair back from his face, and told him good morning in Italian, and he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against her shoulder, and she held him, and this was their morning ritual, and she loved it. "Papa has a boo-boo on his shoulder," she told him. "He's going to be okay. He'll probably stay in bed for most of today, which means he might need some company. What do you think?" Filippo pulled back and looked at her. His dark eyes, Alessandro's eyes, the same absolute black, considered this information with the seriousness that all 3-year-olds bring to important matters. Then he got out of bed and went to the door. She followed him, smiling, down the corridor to the master bedroom door. He was too small to reach the handle. She opened it for him, and he walked in with the particular gravity of a small person on a mission. She waited in the doorway. Filippo crossed the room to the great dark bed. He climbed up the side of it with the determined, methodical physicality of a child who has decided something is being done, and the logistics are simply an obstacle to be managed. He got up, and he crawled across the duvet, and he settled himself with great precision alongside his father's uninjured side. Alessandro woke. She saw it happen, the instant transition from sleep to alertness that was characteristic of him. the eyes opening, already aware. He looked at the ceiling. Then he looked to his right, at the small, warm weight that had appeared beside him. He was very still. Filippo looked at his father. Then he reached over, with his small hand, and patted the bandage on Alessandro's shoulder with exceeding gentleness. Alessandro's throat moved. He lifted his good arm and put it around his son, and Filippo settled against his chest with the absolute, unquestioning trust of a small child who has decided that this particular person is safe, and the decision is final. Elena, in the doorway, turned away before she started crying. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, and thought about the extraordinary nature of small miracles. The morning unfolded slowly, golden and ordinary. Concetta arrived at 8 and found Elena already making breakfast, and the two women moved around the kitchen together in the easy way they had developed over the weeks, Concetta's Neapolitan practicality meshing with Elena's warm chaos, producing results that were consistently better than either would achieve alone. Silvio arrived at 9 with reports that were, evidently, positive. She heard the low rumble of his voice from the study, and Alessandro's responses, shorter and more frequent than she heard on bad days, which she had come to read as a sign that things were resolving. Mother Agatha had been collected from the safe house where she'd been held. Treated well, it turned out, because even Matteo Moroni had apparently had the sense not to harm a 71-year-old woman with a heart condition, and returned to St. Agnes by 3 men of Alessandro's who had apparently been perfectly courteous about it. The Mother Superior had sent, via these men, a message for Elena that Silvio relayed with visible effort at a straight face. "Tell the girl she gave me a fright, and she is to come for Sunday supper and explain herself." Alessandro appeared in the kitchen at 10. His shoulder was in a sling, his shirt was buttoned down for easy dressing, and he had the slightly deliberate quality of movement of someone managing pain without acknowledging it. He looked at Elena. She looked at him. The previous night hung between them, not awkwardly, but with the specific weight of something real that had happened and could not be undone, and that both of them were still in the process of absorbing. "Coffee," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I'll bring it." He sat down. He looked at this, her, the kitchen, the smell of breakfast, Concetta humming at the stove, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and could not immediately classify. She brought him his coffee. He took it with his good hand. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. But Alessandro Moretti was not a man who said thank you easily or often, and she understood the weight being carried by the 2 syllables. And she nodded and went back to the stove, and didn't make it a thing, because making things into things was not always what was needed. From down the corridor came the sound of small, purposeful feet. Filippo arrived in the kitchen, still in his pajamas, towing his stuffed elephant by one ear, and made directly for Elena. He pressed against her leg, looking up at her with those black eyes, and then looked at his father at the table, and then looked back at Elena. Then, in the kitchen, in the morning light, with the coffee smell and the breakfast smell, and Concetta humming in the background, Filippo Moretti opened his small mouth and said, with perfect, careful enunciation, the first words he had spoken in 12 months. "Papa, Lena." The kitchen went entirely quiet. Elena's hands stilled on the spatula. Concetta stopped humming. Alessandro set down his coffee cup. Filippo looked between them with the patient expression of a child who has said a true thing and is waiting for the adults to catch up. Alessandro looked at his son. His face was doing the complex, private thing it sometimes did, the architecture shifting, and Elena could see him working not to let it break entirely open in front of everyone. The discipline of a lifetime fighting the truth of this moment. "Yes," he said finally, his voice rough and very quiet. "That's right, piccolo mio. Papa and Elena." Filippo considered this. Then he went to his chair at the kitchen table and climbed up and reached for his fork. Concetta, at the stove, was crying silently into a dish towel and pretending very hard that she wasn't. They had been avoiding the subject with the careful precision of 2 people who know a conversation exists and have mutually agreed, without words, to leave it on a shelf until they are both ready. The subject was Sofia. Sofia Moretti, née Conti, no relation to Silvio, had been Alessandro's wife for 3 years before her death. The facts that Elena had assembled from various sources, Concetta's careful references, Bruno's brief accounting, the few things Silvio had volunteered, were these. Sophia had been beautiful and precise and difficult in the particular way of people who are accustomed to being the most important person in any room. She had been the daughter of a Roman financial dynasty, had married Alessandro at 24 in a ceremony that half of Italy's criminal aristocracy had attended. She had given birth to Filippo the following year. And she had died on a Tuesday afternoon in February, in the parking garage of the Moretti Tower, caught between two factions of a territorial dispute that had nothing to do with her, shot 3 times while 3-year-old Filippo sat strapped in his car seat in the back of the vehicle and watched everything and understood nothing, except that his mother was gone and the world was permanently, catastrophically unsafe. This was what Elena knew. What she didn't know, what no one who had worked with Alessandro for less than a decade quite knew, was how much, and in what particular ways, Sophia's death had altered the landscape of him. It was Alessandro who brought it up. On a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the warehouse, when Filippo was asleep and Concetta had gone home, and the apartment was quiet with the soft, inhabited quiet of a household at rest, he came and found her in the sitting room, where she was mending a small tear in Filippo's coat, a domestic task that she found calming, the repetitive pull of thread through fabric. And he sat across from her, and he was carrying 2 glasses of red wine, and he set one in front of her without asking, and sat. She continued to sew. She waited. "Sophia," he said, "just the name." Then a pause that lasted long enough for her to complete 2 more stitches. "Tell me what you want to say," she said. He sat with the glass of wine held between both hands, elbows on his knees, and he looked at the floor for a moment before he looked at her. "I have been carrying it wrong," he said. "What happened to her, how I feel about it, I have been carrying it in the way I carry everything, which is to say, by compressing it into something small and putting it somewhere it can't be accessed and telling myself the problem is solved." "And the problem is not solved," she said. "The problem is not solved," he agreed. "What happened to Filippo, what happened to me, is not solved by denial." He turned the glass. "She and I were not happy." He said it simply, without apparent self-pity. "We had been unhappy for most of the marriage. I don't think either of us had the particular qualities the other needed. She needed a man who could be present, who could give her the visibility and the warmth that a woman needs, and He paused. "I was not that man. I was this man, even then. The work always came first." Elena listened and did not fill the silence with reassurance. "But she was Filippo's mother," he said, "and she died in a way that no one should die. And she died in front of him. And I have spent the year since then being furious at a situation that cannot be argued with and cannot be managed and cannot be controlled, which is not a productive use of energy, but has been the primary use of mine regardless." "You've been grieving," she said. "I have been refusing to grieve," he corrected, "which is not the same thing and produces considerably worse results." She set down the coat and the thread. She looked at him. "I was afraid," he said. The word visibly cost him something. "I was afraid that if I let myself feel it, actually feel it, the loss and the failure and the guilt, I wouldn't be able to function. I run a significant portion of the criminal infrastructure of this city, and I have a child who wasn't speaking, and I did not have the luxury of not functioning." "But you also didn't have the luxury of this," she said quietly, gesturing, at the apartment, at the life returning to it, "of things getting better." "No," he said, "I didn't allow for that." She picked up her wine and looked at it, and then looked at him. "I think Sophia would want Filippo to laugh," she said. "I think, regardless of anything between the two of you, regardless of what the marriage was, she was a mother who loved him. And I think if you let yourself believe that, instead of carrying the guilt of not having been able to stop what happened, you might find somewhere to put it down." He was very quiet. "I can't replace her," Elena said. She said it without hedging, clearly, looking at him. "I wouldn't try. What Filippo needs is not a replacement. He needs to know that the world can still have warmth in it, that the people he loves can still be safe, that loss is real, but it doesn't mean everything. And that's not about replacing his mother. That's about teaching him that love doesn't end just because someone leaves. Alessandro looked at her for a very long time. "How are you 22 years old?" he said. She almost laughed. "I grew up fast." "You grew up well," he said. "It's different." He set his wine down. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Just that, just held it, her hand in both of his, her small, warm hand in his large, scarred ones. And they sat like that in the quiet apartment, not speaking, while the city moved around them and Filippo slept, and something that had been frozen for 2 years continued its slow, enormous thaw. The external world, Alessandro had always known, had no particular interest in the private lives of its power structures. It continued to generate crises at its usual rate, regardless of what was happening on the 42nd floor of the Moretti Tower, and Alessandro continued to manage those crises with his customary efficiency. And the only difference now, the only visible, structural difference, was that when he came home from managing them, there was something to come home to. This was, he was discovering, an extraordinarily underrated thing. The Moroni situation had been resolved. Matteo had been persuaded, through a combination of significant threat and equally significant financial leverage, to recede from his current position of aggression and to honor the territorial agreements that had existed between the families for the past decade. He was alive, which was a mercy Alessandro had extended, primarily because Elena had looked at him with those honey-brown eyes when he was still in the hospital bed and said, quietly, "Please," and he found himself, as he was beginning to find in general with requests made by her, unable to say no. This was a significant development in the biography of a man who had said no to everyone for 6 years. Silvio noticed it. Silvio noticed it in the particular way of a man who has served someone closely for a long time and tracks change the way a doctor tracks vital signs, not intrusively but continuously, with the professional attention of someone whose job depends on accurate information. "She's good for you," Silvio said one evening as they were finishing a meeting in the study. Alessandro looked up from the document he was signing. "That's not a topic I invited you to comment on." "No," Silvio agreed. "I'm commenting anyway, which I think proves the point." Alessandro set the pen down. "Your point being?" "6 months ago, you would have had me removed from this room for speaking out of turn." Silvio stood with his enormous arms folded, his relief map face utterly serious. "Now you're asking me what I mean. You're not angry. You're—" He considered the word carefully. "Present." Alessandro said nothing. "She's good for Filippo," Silvio continued, "but she's also good for this family, for what it is and what it can be. The men have noticed it too. There's something different in this building since she arrived, something that was missing." Alessandro was quiet for a long time. "She grew up in an orphanage," he said. "She has paid other people's debts for 3 years at the cost of her own life. She walked into my house and got hit in the head and stayed anyway. And now she is—" He stopped. "She's the Donna this family has been missing," Silvio said simply. Alessandro picked up the pen again. "You're dismissed, Silvio." Silvio left, but the corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did when he was trying not to smile. There was also the matter of other families watching. The underworld had its own intelligence networks and its own gossip circuits, and the fact of Elena's presence in the Moretti household had moved through those circuits in the weeks following the warehouse incident with the specific speed of information that contains both danger and opportunity. 3 separate family heads, the Calabrians, the Luzzatto outfit from Brooklyn, and the remnants of the old Parisi family, now led by a cautious younger son, had sent their own quiet inquiries, their own signals. The message was not subtle. If the Ice King had a weakness, it was noted. If the weakness had a face, it was studied. Alessandro received this intelligence with his characteristic stillness, and then spent a week making very clear, in the understated but absolute language of this world, exactly what would happen to anyone who mistook Elena's presence in his life for a vulnerability rather than a warning. He did not tell Elena about any of this. He did, however, begin to come home for dinner. This sounds small. It was not. Alessandro Moretti had not consistently come home for dinner since he was a child at his parents' table, and the act of sitting down at the kitchen table at 7 o'clock in the evening and eating a meal with his son, and the woman who had walked into his life and refused to walk out. The act of doing this deliberately, repeatedly, as a choice rather than an accident, was something that Conchetta watched with the profound satisfaction of a woman who has wanted this for years and was not going to say so in case it jinxed it. One evening, Filippo, who was speaking now in the tentative, precious way of someone recovering a skill they thought was gone, small words, short sentences, Italian and English mixed together in the unself-conscious way of children who haven't yet been taught to choose, put one hand on his father's sleeve during dinner and said, without preamble or context, "Papa, sing." Everyone looked at Filippo. Filippo looked at his father with complete seriousness. "Papa, sing," he repeated, with slightly more insistence. "I don't," Alessandro began. "He means the lullaby," Elena said. She was looking at her plate, but her mouth was twitching. "I've been singing it every night. Apparently he would like you to participate." Alessandro looked at his son. He looked at Elena, who was very deliberately not making eye contact, and absolutely was laughing. He looked back at Filippo. He hummed 3 bars of the melody, badly and without grace, in the voice of a man who has not sung since childhood. Filippo broke into delighted laughter. Alessandro, on reflection, decided that being laughed at by a 3-year-old was not the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He hummed the rest of the melody to the end. He bought the ring on a Thursday. He did not tell anyone, not Silvio, not Conchetta, not the jeweler from whom he had purchased 6 pieces over the years in the service of various organizational necessities. He went alone, in a car with a single driver, to a family jeweler on the Upper East Side who had been making pieces for the Moretti family for 2 generations, and who had the discretion of a man who understood that the work he did lived at the intersection of sentiment and legacy. Alessandro sat in the shop's back room and looked at what was shown to him and asked for something specific. Not the usual sparkling aggression of a status piece, not the performance of wealth that he could have specified in any of a dozen ways, but something honest, something warm, something that looked like it belonged on the hand of a woman who kneaded bread on a marble island and held children who were screaming and refused to cry when she bled. The jeweler, a small, elderly man named Benedetti, whose family had survived 2 world wars and various political transformations by being excellent at their craft and asking no unnecessary questions, showed him 3 options and watched Alessandro's face. "The second one," Alessandro said. It was a cushion-cut yellow diamond set in rose gold, surrounded by smaller white diamonds arranged in a way that suggested olive branches. It was warm-colored and unusual, and completely unlike anything Alessandro had purchased in his life, and it was, the moment he saw it, entirely correct. He had it sized, and then he put it in his inside jacket pocket, and he brought it back to the penthouse, and he put it in the drawer of his bedside table, and he left it there for 11 days, during which time he told himself he was considering the appropriate moment, and not that he was nervous, because Alessandro Moretti was not a man who experienced nervousness. He was, in the accounting of this particular situation, moderately terrified. Not of her answer. He believed he knew her answer, not with arrogance, but with the specific confidence of a man who has been paying close attention. But of the weight of it, of asking her to take on, with full knowledge and full consent, a life that was genuinely dangerous, a man who was genuinely complicated, a family that was genuinely outside the ordinary world's safety margins. Of asking her to choose this, him, Filippo, all of it, permanently. She deserved to understand what she was choosing. He told her, one evening, more than he had told anyone in 6 years. He told her the truth of his business. Not the glorified version, not the strategic overview, but the granular, unglamorous truth of the Moretti Empire. The men it employed, the methods it used, the lines it would not cross, the lines it had crossed, the bodies it had on its ledger. He told her about his father and his grandfather and the world he had been born into and had chosen to remain in, the calculations he had made about power and safety and the lesser of evils, the things he had done that he could justify to himself and the things he could not entirely justify and had done anyway. He told her this over 2 evenings, in the study, with the lights low and the city spread below the windows, and she listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she was quiet for a long time. "I know what you are," she said finally. I knew what you were when I walked in the door. I wanted to make sure, he said, before I asked you. Before you asked me what, she said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and put the ring box on the coffee table between them. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. I am asking you to be Filippo's mother in all the ways that the word means, he said. I am asking you to be the Donna of this family, which is a real position, with real weight and real danger and real significance, and I will not pretend otherwise. I am asking you to share a life with a man who has significant moral complications and will have them for the foreseeable future, and who is also— He paused. He took a breath. I am also deeply in love with you, Elena. Deeply and without any reservation, and for the first time in my life, without any strategy around it. That is the truest thing I can offer. She picked up the ring box. She opened it. She looked at the ring for a long, quiet moment. The yellow diamond caught the lamplight and sent warm colors across her face. I grew up with nothing, she said. I grew up in a building with drafty windows and too many children and not enough food, and I thought, for a long time, I thought that meant I was designed for small things, that I would live a small life and do small things, and that would be okay. That would be enough. She looked up at him. Her honey eyes were very bright. And then you asked me a rude question about my weight, and your son threw a trophy at my head, and I thought, this is not a small life. She smiled. This is not a small life at all. Elena. Yes, she said. Obviously yes. Yes to all of it. Yes to Filippo, and yes to this apartment, and yes to the things that come with it, and yes— She paused, and her voice went quiet and completely serious. Yes to you. All of you. Even the parts that are hard. He came around the coffee table to her. He was not smooth about it. He was not a man built for graceful romantic gestures, and he knew this, and he also found that he did not care, because she was already laughing and already holding out her hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger, and it was sized perfectly, and he held her hand in his and looked at it. Ti amo, he said. You should know. I've never said that to anyone, and meant all the way to the bottom of it. She put her other hand over their joined ones. Ti amo, she said back. You should know. I say it when I mean it, and I will say it a lot, and you're going to have to get used to it. He brought her hand to his mouth. He kissed her knuckles. I'll practice, he said. Children understand everything. This is the thing that adults consistently underestimate about them. The naive assumption that because a child cannot articulate what they know, they do not know it. Filippo Moretti had been understanding things for his entire short life with a precision that would have alarmed most people had they known the extent of it. And the thing he had been understanding most acutely for the past several weeks was that the world had changed. He told Elena this, in his developing way, on a Sunday morning in the kitchen. He was eating his breakfast, and he said, looking at his toast with the concentration of someone approaching a delicate subject, Papa and Lena stay? Elena was at the stove. She turned around. Yes, she said. Papa and Elena stay. We're not going anywhere. He considered this. He pushed a piece of toast into his egg yolk. Stay forever? He said. Stay forever, she said. He looked up at her. Those black eyes, Alessandro's eyes, steady and serious and so much older than 3 years old. 'Cause you're my mama now, he said. Not a question. Elena set down the spatula. She crossed the kitchen and she crouched down beside his chair so she was at his level. At that level, his level, where he needed people to be. And she looked at him very directly. I am not going to replace your mama, she said, carefully and clearly. Your mama Sophia loved you very much, and she is always, always your mama. But I love you too. I love you the way I love all the big important things, the real way, the keeping kind, the kind that doesn't leave. And if you want to call me Elena, that is perfect. And if, someday, you want to call me something else, she paused. Either way, I'm yours, okay? Filippo looked at her for a long moment. Then he got off his chair and put both arms around her neck, and she held him, crouching there on the kitchen floor, and after a moment he said, right into her ear, very quietly, Okay, Mama. She held him tighter and closed her eyes and breathed. When Alessandro came into the kitchen 5 minutes later, showered, in his morning shirt, reaching for the espresso machine as he always did first thing, he found Elena at the stove again and Filippo at the table, and nothing in the scene to mark it as different from any other morning, except that Elena's eyes were slightly pink at the edges, and Filippo had the particular serene expression of a child who has settled something important to his own satisfaction. Alessandro poured his coffee. He stood at the island. He looked at Elena, who looked back at him over her shoulder, and something passed between them in the way that things increasingly passed between them, a language of glances and small adjustments that was theirs, and said everything without needing words. "He knows," her eyes said. Alessandro looked at his son. Filippo was eating his toast with great seriousness. He set his espresso down and crossed to the table and sat down across from his son. Filippo looked up. "Good morning, piccolo mio," Alessandro said. "Good morning, Papa," Filippo said. He pushed his plate across the table, offering a piece of toast. Alessandro took the toast. He ate it. He had not had toast for breakfast since his own childhood, and it was, he was slightly surprised to discover, excellent. The three of them ate breakfast in the Sunday quiet of the kitchen, and outside the window the city moved through its morning, and inside the apartment there was a warmth that had no word in Alessandro's language for what it was, except possibly, simply, home. It took another conversation, a longer one evening after Filippo was in bed, for Alessandro to tell his son about the ring, about the wedding, about what was going to change and what was not. He sat on the edge of Filippo's bed and he told him, in the simple and direct language that Filippo responded to, that he and Elena were going to get married, which meant they were going to be a family in the official way, and the family was going to stay together. Filippo listened with his elephant under one arm. When Alessandro finished, Filippo said, after a pause, "Can I have a dog?" Alessandro looked at his son for a moment. "We will discuss the dog," he said. Filippo accepted this with equanimity. Alessandro tucked him in and went down the corridor, and he found Elena in the kitchen, as he so often found her, because the kitchen was her center of gravity, and he had long since accepted that this meant the kitchen was now his as well. She looked up at him when he came in. "He wants a dog," Alessandro said. Elena's face broke into its full, unreserved smile, the one she didn't ration, the one that made you feel like the sun had moved to be in your vicinity, and she laughed. "Obviously we're getting a dog," she said. "Obviously," Alessandro said, as though this had always been the plan. Word travels in this world with the speed of something that has a vested interest in its own motion. The Moretti engagement was not formally announced. Alessandro was not a man who sent press releases about his private life, and the criminal world did not conduct its social affairs in newspapers. But within the relevant circles, within the specific geography of power and family and obligation that constituted the world he inhabited, the news moved. It moved in phone calls and at meetings, and in the particular shorthand of men who have been watching the Moretti family's fortunes for years, with the combination of admiration and calculation that power always generates in those who are not quite powerful enough. The reactions were as varied as the people having them. The Calabrian distributors, pragmatic men who cared more about predictable business arrangements than the personal lives of their partners, sent flowers and a case of excellent wine. The Luzzatto family, who had been cautiously recalibrating their relationship with the Moretti organization since the Moroni incident and Alessandro's subsequent display of decisive force, sent a representative with a congratulatory message that was, reading between its polite lines, a request to clarify that the previous territorial arrangements remained in place. They did. Alessandro confirmed this with the economy of a man who is tired of having this conversation and appreciates brevity. The Parisi family, the cautious younger son, whose name was Enzo and who had been raised less in this world than his father and had always seemed slightly uncomfortable in his own authority, came personally. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and sat across from Alessandro in the study, and said, with a directness that Alessandro respected because it was uncommon in people in Enzo's position, "She's good for you. Everyone can see it. I want you to know that my family takes this as a sign of stability, not weakness." Alessandro looked at him for a long moment. "I appreciate the distinction," he said. Not all reactions were positive. There were murmurs, as there always were, about women who came from outside the world and moved into its center, about Elena's background, her finances, her family. She had none. The question of whether someone raised in an orphanage could be trusted with the particular weight of the Donna's position. These murmurs reached Alessandro's ears, as all things reached Alessandro's ears, and he addressed them with the instrument he had always found most effective in his world: silence, followed by a demonstration of what happened to people who tested the limits of his patience. The murmurs subsided. Elena herself knew about some of it. She was not naive. She had done her research before she walked through the Moretti Tower's revolving door, and she had continued to pay attention. And she was 22, but she was not 22 in any of the ways that made 22 a vulnerability. She had known, when she agreed, that the world she was moving into had teeth, and she had agreed anyway, and she was not going to spend her life in it looking surprised by its nature. She did, however, have one conversation that she had been putting off, with Mother Agatha. Sunday supper at St. Agnes arrived, as summoned things do, with a combination of warmth and reckoning that was entirely characteristic of the woman who had demanded it. Elena brought Filippo. Alessandro had insisted on staying home, sensing correctly that this particular conversation required a one-to-one, and also that the presence of the man whose organization had been involved in the kidnapping of Mother Agatha was perhaps not the best opening gesture, and arrived at the orphanage in the car that Alessandro had arranged, which she felt slightly embarrassed about given the state of St. Agnes's driveway. Mother Agatha was 71 and looked 60, and moved like someone who had made a private deal with time, and time had begrudgingly agreed to the terms. She was short and solid, and had hair like iron and eyes like polished coal, and she loved Elena with the fierce, unsentimental love of a woman who does not permit herself sentiment, but made an exception. She looked at Filippo, who had held Elena's hand the entire drive, and was now looking around the orphanage's living room with wide eyes and what appeared to be genuine interest, and her face did something complicated. "He has his father's eyes," she said. "He does," Elena said. "Sit down," Mother Agatha said. "The children are going to want to meet him." The supper was extraordinary, in the way that suppers orchestrated by women who know how to use food as love always are. The 14 children of St. Agnes circulated around Filippo with the practiced social fluency of children who have always lived in a communal household. And Filippo, who had never in his life had access to this quantity of contemporaries, was initially overwhelmed, and then, with the adaptability of the very young, not overwhelmed at all, but thriving, pulled into a game of some kind in the corner with 3 others his age and clearly having the time of his life. Mother Agatha and Elena sat together. "Tell me about him," Mother Agatha said. Elena told her, not the version she might tell someone she wanted to reassure, the actual version, the complexity of him, the darkness and the warmth both, the man who had ordered terrible things and paid off an orphanage without mentioning it, the man who sat on the kitchen floor and learned to make blue handprints, the man who had taken a bullet and called it nothing, the man who was learning, at 30, how to eat breakfast with his family. Mother Agatha listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You love him," Mother Agatha said. "Yes," Elena said. "You've made your decision." "Yes." "Then I have one thing to say." Mother Agatha picked up her fork. "The accounts of this orphanage have been in better condition for the past month than they have been in 20 years. I ask no questions about the source of this, because I am not a fool, and I prefer to remain ignorant of certain things for the sake of my own conscience." She pointed the fork at Elena. "But if that man ever does anything to harm you, physically, emotionally, in any of the ways that men with power can harm women without power, I want to know immediately. And I do not care how many soldiers he has." Elena looked at her for a long moment. "Understood," she said. Mother Agatha nodded once. "Good. Now eat. You're too thin." Elena, who was emphatically not too thin, ate anyway, because some battles are not worth fighting. It was not a simple thing, building a life. This was the truth that no story told you when it was busy being romantic. The truth underneath the grand gestures and the declarations. That the real work was in the daily, uncinematic accumulation of small choices. Getting up in the morning and choosing again. Making space for another person's patterns and rhythms. Learning the specific grammar of someone else. The way Alessandro expressed affection through practical acts rather than words. The way Elena expressed anxiety by cleaning things that were already clean. The way Filippo needed 10 minutes of quiet after any significant stimulation before he could process and speak. Learning to read these things and responding to what you had read and being responded to in return. This was the language they were all three learning. Alessandro was, Elena discovered, a man of extraordinary physical attention. Not in the obvious way, though that too, increasingly, as the weeks passed, but in the specific, particular way of someone who had spent years disconnected from the world by choice and was now reconnecting through touch in the careful, wondering way of a person recovering a sense they had decided they no longer needed. He touched her constantly, not possessively, not with the heavy-handed, territorial energy she might have expected from what she knew of him, but with presence. A hand at her back when they walked together, a thumb tracing her jaw when he wanted to look at her face, his fingers lacing through hers in the evenings on the sofa while they talked about the day. Small things, continuous things, the accumulated evidence of a man who was learning to be warm again and was doing it through his hands, because his hands were more honest than his words had ever been trained to be. She touched him back in kind. She was not shy about it. She was not shy about much, Elena Rossi, and touch had never frightened her the way it seemed to frighten some people. She had grown up in a building full of children who needed to be held, and she had grown up understanding that skin was the first and most honest language. She touched his face in the mornings when he looked tired. She pushed his hair back when it fell forward. She touched his scarred hands with her fingers when they sat together, not commenting on the scars, just acknowledging them. She leaned against him when they stood at the kitchen window watching the city. She was not performing affection, and she was not being careful about it. She was simply living it, which was the only way she knew how. He was learning her body the way a person learns a landscape they intend to inhabit permanently, with attention, with the understanding that some things take time to know fully and are worth knowing correctly. She was soft in all the places that the world had tried to tell her she shouldn't be soft, and he traced her curves with his hands as though cataloging something precious, something that had been locked behind glass for a long time and was now, finally, permitted to be touched. "You're beautiful," he told her one evening, quietly, without editorializing. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, pulling off her shoes, and she looked at him, at this man in his domestic shirt with the collar open, sitting against the headboard watching her, and she said, "I know." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm working on it," she amended. "But, yes, I'm working on knowing it." "Good," he said, and reached for her hand. They had their arguments, of course, because a life without conflict is a life with no stakes. Elena was not a docile woman. She had strong opinions and a quick temper that she had learned to manage but had never quite fully tamed, and she was not interested in managing it around Alessandro, who would not, she suspected, have wanted her to. Alessandro had his own temper, a much colder and more contained one, which expressed itself in silence and withdrawal rather than noise. And learning how to reach him when he withdrew, how to push through the ice without breaking it, or to wait at the edge of it until he came back, took time and got it wrong sometimes. She learned that he needed 20 minutes after a difficult call or meeting before he could be present with her without the meeting's residue still on him. She learned to give him those 20 minutes without comment, and then to bring him food, because he forgot to eat when he was in the grip of something operational, and food was her vocabulary for, "I see you, and you are not alone." He learned that she cried easily, and it did not mean catastrophe, that Elena's tears came readily at beautiful things as often as at hard ones, and that the appropriate response was to hold her and say nothing and let it pass, rather than to attempt to solve whatever had caused the tears, because often nothing had caused them except the sheer accumulated weight of being a person in the world. He was not, at first, good at this. He was programmed by nature and conditioning to solve things. He would try to problem-solve the tears, and she would have to tell him, gently, with her face against his shoulder, that no problem needed solving, that she just needed to be held. And he would be still, and hold her, and she could feel, each time, the slight recalibration of his instincts as he worked against the pull of his own nature in the service of what she needed. He got better at it, This was one of the extraordinary things about him. He paid attention and he learned. With the same focused application he brought to everything he decided was worth mastering. The apartment continued to change around them. Small evidence of a life being built. Filippo's drawings taped to the refrigerator alongside a proper gallery of the children of the orphanage that Elena had printed and framed for the hallway. A second toothbrush beside Alessandro's in the master bathroom. Recipe cards in Elena's handwriting pinned above the stove. A dog bed in the corner of the kitchen. They had, in fact, gotten the dog, a large, somewhat ridiculous golden retriever named Oro, who immediately became Filippo's most devoted companion and Alessandro's most reluctant affection, though the affection was real, as evidenced by the way he fed Oro from the table when he thought no one was watching. Life, in its ordinary and extraordinary way, was being built. 6 weeks before the wedding, Silvio came to Elena with his hat in his hands, metaphorically, since Silvio was not a hat-wearing man, and said that there was a tradition in the Moretti family that the bride received a gift from the underboss on behalf of the family, and that the gift was his to choose. He gave her a key. "To what?" she said, looking at the key in her palm. It was old, genuinely old, iron rather than modern metal, the kind of key that opens something of substance. "The Moretti property in Amalfi," Silvio said. "The house there. Alessandro's grandmother built it in 1948. He hasn't been back since before Sofia died. He hasn't been able to go." Silvio's face was its usual relief map. "But I think you could take him." Elena looked at the key for a long time. Then she looked at Silvio. "He doesn't know you're giving me this," she said. "No," Silvio agreed, "but he will." She went to Alessandro that evening and showed him the key and watched his face do the complex, private thing it did when something touched the places he didn't usually let things touch. "Amalfi," he said. "After the wedding," she said. "Just the three of us. A week. The sea and the house and no phones." He looked at the key in her palm, at her hand, at the ring, at the key. "My grandmother made the best limoncello in the region," he said. "She would have liked you." "Then we'll go back for her," Elena said. "And for you." He took the key from her hand and held it. He turned it between his fingers the way he turned his espresso glass. "There's a lemon tree in the garden," he said. "She planted it the year the war ended. She said it was her way of believing there would be summers to come." He paused. "It was still there the last time I went. I was 14. "It'll be there when we go," Elena said. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, with that unguarded quality that still slightly surprised her when she encountered it, as though part of her hadn't quite accepted yet that this was real. "Elena," he said. "What?" "I've been thinking about your life," he said. "What it would have been, if you'd kept going the way you were going. 3 jobs, and the debt, and the orphanage, and—" He stopped. "You would have managed. You always manage. But it would have cost you things." "It already cost me things," she said. She said it without self-pity, simply. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. I'm not going to tell you that this life is uncomplicated. The danger is real. The weight of this position is real. What I ask of you is more than what a person should reasonably be asked." He met her eyes. "But I will spend the rest of my life making sure that what I give you back is worth it. I promise you that." She thought, in that moment, of the girl she had been, the girl who took the bus to Fifth Avenue in the damp morning with no umbrella, with her worn purse and her cheap dress and her determination and her faith. The girl who had walked into the most dangerous household in New York because she believed she could get through a child's walls. "You've already more than started," she said. They sat together in the quiet of the study, the room where she had first sat across from him and refused to be diminished, and held the old iron key between them like a promise. And outside the window, New York was its brilliant, impossible, beautiful, dangerous self, and neither of them needed anything more than this. In the weeks running up to the wedding, the apartment became what it had perhaps never been in its long, marble-floored life, genuinely chaotic. Concetta, who had apparently been waiting her entire tenure with the Moretti family for an occasion to exercise the full breadth of her organizational enthusiasm, descended on the wedding preparations with an energy that was slightly alarming in a woman of 70. She had opinions about flowers, and strong opinions about catering, and truly immovable opinions about the guest list, which she reviewed with Alessandro over 2 hours at the kitchen table, in a meeting that Elena observed from the doorway with mingled admiration and mild terror. Elena's wedding dress had been a negotiation. Alessandro had, with characteristic directness, told her that cost was entirely irrelevant and that she was to have what she wanted. And Elena had, with characteristic pragmatism, spent 3 weeks arguing herself down from the extravagance of what she actually wanted, before Concetta found out about this and put a firm stop to it. "You are about to become the Donna of the Moretti family," Concetta had said, with the finality of someone closing a case. "You will have the dress." The dress was designed by a woman in Rome, whom Alessandro knew professionally, an extraordinary woman who listened to Elena for 4 hours, measured her with the reverent precision of an artist approaching a canvas, and then disappeared for 3 weeks and came back with something that made Elena stand in front of the fitting room mirror and simply put her hands over her mouth. It was a corseted mermaid silhouette in ivory silk with lace overlays, and it was cut to the exact and specific geometry of her particular body. The narrow waist and the full hips, the soft curves that the world had spent years teaching her to hide, now placed and celebrated and made architectural. She looked in the mirror and she saw herself, completely and without apology, dressed in something that said, "This is what a woman looks like." Filippo, brought in for the final fitting, walked around her in a slow circle with the expression of a connoisseur. "Princess," he said. "Thank you, my love," Elena said. Alessandro was not permitted to see the dress. He was told this in clear terms by Elena, by Concetta, by Silvio, who had been recruited to the wedding preparation committee in ways he could not entirely trace back to a specific decision, and by Filippo, who delivered the message with great seriousness. "Papa, you can't see the dress." Alessandro accepted this with the dignity of a man who has learned when he is outnumbered. The night before the wedding, Elena lay in what was now entirely and without ambiguity their bed, and Alessandro lay beside her, and neither of them was sleeping, and the city was doing its city thing below them, and after a long, comfortable silence, he said, "Are you afraid?" She thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "Not of you, not of tomorrow, of the size of it, of trying to be equal to it." "You're already equal to it," he said. "You've been equal to it since the day you got off the elevator." She turned toward him in the dark. "Are you afraid?" she asked. A pause. "Yes," he said. "Of what?" "Of being someone who deserves you," he said. "Of whether that's achievable." She reached over and found his hand in the dark and held it. "It's not about deserving," she said. "It's about doing. Every day. That's all." "Then I can do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I've watched you do it for months." The city hummed. The dog snored at the foot of the bed. Somewhere down the corridor, Filippo slept. Tomorrow. The rest of their lives. The morning of the wedding came in like a gift. October in New York, and the weather had done the thing it does occasionally in October when everything conspires to be beautiful. Crisp air, sky the particular blue that occurs before the seasons settle into winter, light that slanted gold and long across the stone faces of the city's buildings. The kind of morning that felt intentional. The ceremony was held in a private estate in Long Island that Alessandro had used for significant functions before, and that had been transformed, by Concetta's formidable organizational will and a budget that Elena had genuinely preferred not to see in its entirety, into something that lived exactly at the intersection of old Italian beauty and New York power. White flowers everywhere, gardenias and white roses and jasmine, the scent of a southern Italian garden transplanted into the Long Island autumn. Candelabras tall as standing men, silk draping in cream and gold. The long central aisle floored in fresh white rose petals, stretching from the entrance of the main hall to the altar where Alessandro stood. The guests were, this being a wedding in this particular world, less a gathering of friends and family in the conventional sense, and more a display of alliances, a demonstration of the new shape of the Moretti family's position. There were 300 people seated in the hall, and their presence was itself a statement. Every significant family in the New York organization, the Calabrian partners, the Luzzatto family, the Parisi family, the various legitimate business interests woven through the empire. They had come because they were invited, and because attendance was itself a communication. And they sat in their finery and waited. At the head of the aisle, Alessandro stood. He was dressed by the same Milanese tailor who had made his suit since he was 24, and the suit was black on black, jacket and trousers and silk shirt in the same darkness, cut to the precise geography of his body, which required no flattery from fabric because the body did its own work. His hair was swept back. His face was not its usual stone. Silvio, standing beside him as best man, looked at his Don's face and then looked away. Alessandro was not performing composure. He was not exerting the usual discipline of the mask. He was simply standing at the end of an aisle, waiting for something, and the waiting had stripped away the architecture he normally put between himself and the world, and what remained, what Silvio could see, what everyone close enough to see could see, was a man in love. Straightforward, enormous, undisguised. The music changed. The doors at the far end of the hall opened. Elena stepped into the doorway. She came in on the arm of Mother Agatha, who had, with characteristic decisiveness, appointed herself to this role weeks ago and informed Elena of the fact rather than asking, which Elena had accepted with complete happiness. And the hall did the thing that halls do in that specific moment. It went very quiet, and then, in a wave beginning at the back and moving forward, it turned to look. She was extraordinary. The dress had been designed for her, designed with the specific understanding that her body was not a problem to be solved, but a form to be honored, and it was doing everything its maker had intended. The corseted bodice accentuated the dramatic narrowness of her waist. The silk fell over her hips and thighs in the long, curving line of a mermaid silhouette that moved as she walked with a slowness and grandeur that was entirely the dress's doing. The lace overlays caught the candelabra light and threw it back in a shimmer. Her dark hair was up, elaborate and full, threaded through with small white jasmine flowers. Her neck was bare except for a thin chain with a single diamond at the base of her throat. Her face was what it always was. Open, warm, slightly overwhelmed, the honey-brown eyes very bright. She looked like a woman who could not quite believe that this was real and had decided to walk into it anyway, fully and without reservation. Behind her, trotting with enormous seriousness in a miniature black tuxedo, holding the end of her veil in two small hands, was Filippo. He was taking his responsibility profoundly seriously. His little face was set in an expression of absolute concentration. He was walking very carefully, his small feet finding each step with great care, his grip on the veil steady. He was the most serious 3-year-old in the history of the institution of marriage. Alessandro saw them come through the door, and he stopped breathing. Not in any metaphorical sense. He literally stopped breathing, for several seconds, as the image registered. Elena in the ivory silk and the jasmine, Mother Agatha upright and fierce at her side, Filippo with his veil, and something in his chest performed the anatomical equivalent of a tectonic shift. He breathed again, deliberately. Silvio, beside him, said nothing, but his hand briefly touched Alessandro's arm, once, and then was gone. Elena came down the aisle, and the 300 people of Alessandro Moretti's world watched her come, and she did not look at any of them. She looked at him. The whole length of the aisle, she looked at him, and her eyes were full, and her chin was up, and she was smiling, and it was the smile that she gave in the kitchen, and on the floor, and at the window. The full, unreserved, whole-sky smile that had been cracking his defenses since the day she arrived, and she was walking directly toward him, as though there were nothing else in the room. There wasn't. Not for him. She arrived at the altar. Mother Agatha placed Elena's hand in Alessandro's, with the solemnity of a woman conducting a sacrament, and then stepped back, and Alessandro held her hand, and looked at her face, and the priest began to speak. He barely heard the priest. He was attending to Elena, to the weight of her hand in his, to the small tremor in her fingers that told him she was working to keep steady, to the exact color of her eyes in this light, to the way she was looking at him. Vows. He had written them himself. Silvio had offered resources for this, a speechwriter, examples, templates, and Alessandro had dismissed all of it, because the words he needed to say to Elena were not words that could be written by anyone else, and he had sat with a pen and paper in his study late at night and found them. He spoke them now, quietly, to her, as though the 300 people did not exist. "I have spent my life learning to be hard," he said, "because the world rewarded hardness and punished softness, and I was an excellent student. I became very good at being unreachable." He held her hand between both of his. "And then you walked into my house and got hit in the head with a trophy, and you got down on the floor and you opened your arms anyway. And I watched that, and I thought," he paused, "I thought, that is strength. What I have is not strength. What she has is strength." His eyes held hers. "I am promising you, today, that I will spend every year of the rest of my life trying to be half as brave as you are. I am promising Filippo a father who shows up, on the floor, at his level, every week, without fail. And I am promising you a man who will love you without condition, without strategy, and without any remaining reservation. Ti amo, mia regina, today and always." Elena was crying. She had warned him she would cry, and she was, silently, with the contained dignity of someone who has permitted themselves the tears and is not embarrassed by them. She gathered herself. "I walked into your house with nothing," she said. Her voice was steady. "A worn-out dress and a fake confidence, and more years of practice at loving difficult people than you could possibly have known. I thought I was coming to do a job." She smiled through the tears, and it was the full smile, the kitchen smile, the window smile, the smile that contained everything. "Instead, I found my home." She looked at Filippo, who was watching them both with absolute seriousness from his position 3 feet away. She looked back at Alessandro. "I found my son, and I found my family, and I found you, all of you, the hard parts and the soft parts, and the parts still learning how to be both." She squeezed his hand. "I love you with everything I have, Alessandro Moretti, which is more than I know how to measure, so I'll just keep showing you." The priest pronounced them married. Alessandro kissed her. It was not a theatrical gesture. It was not performed for the room. It was simply, completely, the kiss of a man in full possession of what he has been given, and grateful beyond any ability to perform it. His hand came up to her face. Her hands were on his chest, and the room was there and was not there, and the candelabras burned warm around them, and when they separated and looked at each other, they were both slightly laughing. Filippo, deciding that the ceremony had now achieved its correct conclusion, marched forward and inserted himself between them, with his arms around both of their legs. 300 people of Alessandro Moretti's world, men who had conducted transactions in blood and silence, women who had weathered storms by being unmovable, stood and applauded. Outside, distantly, the first fireworks went up over the Long Island coast, arranged by Alessandro's people to go off at this specific moment because he had planned it, quietly, 2 months ago, and had told no one, and the sky above New York exploded in cascades of gold and white. The lemon tree in Amalfi was still there. It stood in the corner of the garden of the house that Alessandro's grandmother had built in 1948, a stone house on a hillside above the sea, with blue shutters and terracotta tiles, and a garden that had grown wild and gentle with decades of only occasional attention. And it was old and gnarled and absolutely, stubbornly alive. Its branches had spread over the years into the kind of extravagant width that trees achieve when they are not managed for purpose, but simply allowed to exist. And in October, improbably, it still held a few last lemons like small suns caught in the branches. Elena found it on the first morning. She had woken early, earlier than Alessandro, who was still asleep in the old stone room with the blue shutters, more soundly and longer than she had ever seen him sleep, as though something had been put down that had been carried for a very long time. And she had dressed quietly and taken her coffee into the garden to watch the sun come up over the sea. The sea from this hillside was the deep, impossible blue of the Tyrrhenian, and the morning light was rose gold and very clear, and she stood in the garden of the dead grandmother's house with her coffee going cold in her hands and felt something enormous and quiet settle in her. It was happiness. She recognized it, though she had not had it in exactly this form before, not this specific compound of love and safety and hope and the sun on the sea and the lemon tree and the man still sleeping inside, all of it present and real and hers. She stood with it the way you stand in warm water, letting it hold you. Filippo appeared in the garden doorway in his pajamas. He came to her immediately, pressed against her side, and she put her arm around him, and they stood together looking at the sea. "Pretty," he said. "Very pretty," she agreed. "Papa's grandmother's house," he said. "Yes, Papa grew up coming here, when he was small, like you." Filippo considered this, looking out at the sea. Papa was little? "Everyone was little once," she said. He thought about this.
Then, even Silvio?
She laughed. She laughed genuinely, fully, the whole sky laugh, and the sound of it went out over the sea. When Alessandro appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, unshaven for the first time she had seen, his hair disordered, a sweater over his pajamas, carrying coffee, he found them in the garden under the lemon tree, Elena sitting in the old iron chair with Filippo on her lap, both of them looking out at the sea with the particular quality of people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. He stood in the doorway and looked at them. Then he came into the garden. He pulled another chair alongside hers, close, and sat, and she leaned toward him, and he put his arm around her without thought, without calculation, the way you extend a limb that has become habitual. And Filippo shifted to redistribute himself across both of them with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a child who has concluded that laps are communal property. They sat under the grandmother's lemon tree and watched the sun move up over the Tyrrhenian Sea, and the coffee was good, and the air smelled of salt and citrus, and nothing was required of any of them except this. "She planted it the year the war ended," Alessandra said, after a while, looking at the tree. "She said it was her way of believing there would be summers to come." "She was right," Elena said. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her, as though she contained a light he hadn't expected to find in the world, and he was still in the process of adjusting to its presence. He touched her face, once, briefly, with the backs of his fingers. "She was right," he agreed. Filippo reached up and grabbed a low branch of the lemon tree, pulling himself partially upright. "Lemon," he announced. "Yes," Alessandra said. "Leave them on the tree." "Why?" "Because some things are better where they grow," Alessandra said. Then he looked at Elena and his mouth moved, and he was not a man who smiled easily or often, but he was smiling now, and it was, in Elena's private accounting, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Your grandmother would have agreed with that. She kissed his jaw. He turned his head and kissed her properly, briefly, warmly, and Filippo made the sound that all children make when their parents kiss, which is a sound of disgusted delight. "Gross," Filippo said, with authority. "Absolutely," Elena agreed. "Indisputably," Alessandra said. The week in Amalfi unfolded in the slow, golden way of time spent in places built for living rather than for business. They swam in the sea below the house, Elena and Filippo in the shallow water close to the rocks, while Alessandro, who swam powerfully and with the efficient pleasure of someone who has always been comfortable in the water, moved farther out and came back and found them building things in the sand. They cooked in the house's old stone kitchen, Elena teaching Filippo to make fresh pasta, while Alessandro sat at the kitchen table, watching them with his espresso, and what she had come to identify as his particular expression of contented observation, the expression of a man in the presence of something he did not previously believe was available to him. They visited the village below the house, where an elderly woman in a black dress recognized the house and therefore recognized Alessandro, and told him, in rapid Neapolitan dialect, that he looked exactly like his grandmother, and that his grandmother had been the best woman she had ever known. Alessandro received this information with more visible emotion than Elena had ever seen him show in public. "She would have said the same about you," he told the woman, meaning it. They ate at a small restaurant on the water on the fourth evening, and the owner came out to meet them because word had traveled even here, to this small Amalfi village, of the Moretti wedding, and the man pressed wine on them and grappa and refused any payment, and they sat on the terrace above the water as the stars came out, and Filippo fell asleep in his chair with his head on Elena's arm, and Alessandro sat across from her in the candlelight, and they talked. Not about anything operational or significant, but about small things, the kind of things that build a life out of the accumulation of themselves. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and who had planted the same jasmine in the Rome apartment that his grandmother had planted in Amalfi, so that both places had always smelled the same to him. She told him about the first child she had cared for at St. Agnes, a 4-year-old boy named Marco, who had arrived screaming every night for the first 6 months, and then one morning had woken up and walked into the kitchen and said, matter-of-factly, that he wanted eggs.
It's always like that, she said. The healing. Not dramatic, just one day, eggs. He looked at her across the candlelight and the sleeping child. One day, eggs, he agreed. On the last night in Amalfi, after Filippo was asleep and the village had gone quiet and the sea was dark below them, they stood on the terrace of the house and looked at the stars. Alessandro stood behind her with his arms around her, his chin resting on her head, and they were still. I want to bring him back every year, Alessandro said. This house, the sea. Yes, she said. I want him to know where he comes from, he said. I want you to know it too. I already feel it, she said. This place, it feels like yours. It's ours, he said. It's always been ours. You just hadn't arrived yet. She turned in his arms and looked at his face. This man, her beautiful devil, her husband, her home, in the starlight over the Tyrrhenian Sea. I'm here now, she said. He kissed her forehead. He kissed her temple, the place where the trophy had left its small ghost of a bruise months ago, now entirely healed and gone. He kissed her cheek. He held her face in his hands and looked at her. Ti amo, mia regina, he said. My son's tears brought you to me, and your kiss. He paused. The words were there and he said them, completely, without armor. Your kiss tamed the monster in me forever. She pulled him down and kissed him under the stars, and the sea was dark and old and beautiful below them, and the lemon tree in the garden held its last late fruit. And in the old stone room with the blue shutters, the boy they had each claimed, and who had claimed them back, slept the deep, safe sleep of a child who knows, in his bones, that the people who love him are close. And in the morning, there would be coffee and eggs and the sea, and the three of them, and the lemon tree. And that was everything. Fine. Alessandro Moretti ruled the Moretti Empire for another 20 years with the same calculated efficiency, and 3 people knew the version of him that existed underneath the empire: his son, his wife, and himself. Filippo grew up fluent in both Italian and English, and his father's silences and his mother's warmth, and became, eventually, exactly the kind of man his parents had hoped he would be. Mother Agatha lived to be 91, and remained, to the end, the most formidable woman Elena had ever known. St. Agnes Orphanage was fully endowed, and its mortgage burned in a small ceremony that Mother Agatha attended and Elena cried at, and Alessandro stood through, with his arms folded and his eyes suspiciously bright. Oro, the golden retriever, lived to be 14, and remained until his last day Filippo's most devoted companion, and the only creature in the Moretti household who could get away with stealing food off the table. Alessandro never entirely stopped standing in doorways, watching his family. He never wanted to. New York at night from 42 floors up is not a city. It is an argument, a case being made continuously and without apology for the proposition that human beings can build things worth looking at. Elena stood at the window of the Moretti penthouse 1 year after the Amalfi trip, 2 years after she had first walked through the lobby downstairs with her worn purse and her wet shoes and her faith. And she looked at the argument the city was making, and she thought it had a point. Behind her, Alessandro was on the floor. He was on the floor of the living room with Filippo, who was 4 now and in full possession of a vocabulary he deployed with enthusiasm at all hours. And they were building something elaborate with Filippo's building blocks. Oro was lying across Alessandro's feet. The construction project appeared to be generating significant disagreement about structural methodology, which Filippo was expressing at some volume. "No, Papa, the blue ones go here. The blue ones are load-bearing." "They're not," Silvio said. Silvio is not an architect. He said he was a construction expert. Silvio has opinions that exceed his expertise in many areas.
Elena smiled at the window and the city and everything. She pressed her palm to the glass the way he pressed his palm to the glass when he stood here, and she felt the cold of it and the life of the city through it, and she felt, simultaneously, the warmth behind her. The argument about building blocks, the dog snoring, the lamp on the coffee table throwing its gold light across the room. And she thought about what Bruno had told her a long time ago, that the last time this kitchen had smelled like that, the Don's wife had been alive. It smelled like that now. It had smelled like that every day since she arrived. Not because she was replacing anything, not because the past had been erased or the grief had been pretended away, but because life was like that, like the lemon tree, like the jasmine that Alessandra's mother and grandmother had planted in 2 different cities so that both places would smell like home. It found its way to warmth. It grew toward it. It survived. She heard him stand. She heard the blocks clatter in some new arrangement and Filippo's tone shift from argument to satisfaction, which meant the construction had achieved some acceptable outcome. She heard the footsteps on the marble, and then she felt the warmth of him behind her, his hands at her waist, his chest against her back, and the city spread below them, glittering and indifferent and beautiful. "The blue blocks," he said into her hair. "Were they load-bearing?" "No," he admitted. He was right. He usually is, which is deeply inconvenient. She laughed and leaned back against him, and his arms came around her, and they stood at the window over the city and watched it burn and sparkle below them. And from behind them, Filippo said, with great satisfaction, "It's a castle." They looked at each other's reflection in the glass. "A castle," Alessandra said. She turned in his arms and looked up at him. This man, her husband, her devil and her home. "A sanctuary," she said. He kissed her, there at the window over New York, while the city made its beautiful argument below, and their son built his castle on the floor, and the dog snored, and the lights went on forever. "Ti amo, mia regina. Ti amo, mio diavolo. Always."